We are glad that you're here because we're here at a very important time when obviously many things are on our mind, but money seems to be, every problem that we are talking about seems to come back to money. Here is our co-host, Heather Sharon. By the way, my name's Ken Davis. Heather and I will be... Heather and I will try to do the best we can to hold the conversation to at least a reasonable level of of whatever it is.
No fisticuffs, I think.
Yeah, no fisticuffs, right. Heather, so we talked a little earlier about how all of this is really down to money, right?
I think we would probably all agree that journalism in general and Chicago journalism in specific is at an inflection point, much like it was 11 years ago when the first town hall took place. And certainly I'm not going to recap 11 years of journalism history now. I know you're all really disappointed. But some of the highlights and the lowlights, I think certainly the Sun-Times survived a near-death experience, and now the Tribunes, yeah, we can clap for the Sun-Times. And now the future of the Tribune is a little bit in flux. But 10 years ago, nobody could have predicted the rise of independent, digital, online organizations, and I'm certainly a representative of those people as the managing editor and City Hall reporter of the Daily Line. So we have a lot to talk about, but first and foremost, I'm a reporter by train and by trade, and shout out every other Medill person who's here. And I would probably be remiss if I didn't turn to two of our panelists here and put them on the spot a little bit, since that's what Medill taught me how to do. Bruce Dole, the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, and Charlie Johnson, the representative of the Chicago Tribune Guild. As we speak, the first ever union contract negotiations are going on. And I have to turn it over to both of you to see if you can give us an update on how that's been going.
Well, if you want a perspective from in the room, you got to go to Charlie, because I'm not directly in the conversation, so I get it briefed on them. But if Charlie wants to speak to how they're going.
Yeah, I spent the last 2 days sequestered in a conference room at a law firm bargaining the Tribune's first union contract. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of what was said, I think the perspective of the union is that for a variety of reasons, many of them outside of the control of the Chicago Tribune, some of them within the control of the Tribune, the pay, benefits, and working conditions of being a Tribune reporter, photographer, editor, producer, etc., have degraded to a point that they have to be seriously addressed and reformed. And that I can say, as someone who's working in the newsroom every day, that we're seeing a lot of people come to us and express, sometimes privately, other times publicly on social media, that they're concerned about the long-term health of the institution, and they're concerned about their ability to have a career at the Tribune that might last 20 or 30 or 40 years. There are a number of people who already work second jobs. They hack Uber, they drive kids to school in the morning, they deliver flowers. These are not, let's say, interns or first-year people who are doing this to try and make ends meet while they're fresh out of school. These are people with notable bylines and prestigious fellowships. And what the union is essentially putting on the table, what we put on the table on Thursday and Friday, is our vision of a new future at the Tribune, a new reality for what it is to work there, and a way to have a career at the paper that might stretch years or decades, like many of the people who we honor at our annual awards. Every person who's worked there for 30 years gets a great video tribute, and that is a reality that is frankly going to become, in our opinion, likely non-existent at a certain point. There's been a lot of people who've left the paper, middle career, early career, because they simply didn't see it as a sustainable place to work anymore, with mortgages, with children, et cetera. What we're seeking And what we're proposing, what we have proposed, what we'll continue to fight for is some version of a new deal. For many years, the Tribune paid above the union scale of the Chicago Sun-Times. It treated its employees very well. I've heard anecdotes about if two Tribune employees got married, they got a set of silver, for example, from the Tribune at their wedding. I don't know whether that's true or not, but someone check that out.
It's a rumor, huh?
Can we get a fact check in the room?
Yeah.
Please do.
Let me go to Bruce. Let me give you a chance to respond.
Everybody's deeply concerned about the future
Could I just
of the
interject,
Tribune.
more than just respond to that, give us a sense of what you're feeling about the Tribune right now and the crisis that it's
What I
facing.
feel is that the single greatest threat facing the Tribune and facing every legacy news organization is the duopoly of Facebook and Google. They control, 75% of digital advertising. And so every organization that has been trying to make the shift from print advertising to digital has run up against this blockade. You throw in Amazon, and they just about control everything. So there are a lot of efforts on that regard. There's efforts in Congress to try and give news organizations some relief from antitrust so they could negotiate with the two shops. There's effort in Europe that's farther along in requiring the platforms to pay for the content that they are using. So there are legal efforts, there are political efforts, all that saying we're providing this information. Google and Facebook are taking full advantage of it. They do need to pay something for it. They make feints. They suggest that they're going to provide some funding, but we just really haven't seen it so far. On
Charlie?
subscriptions, on the work that directly goes directly to what our great journalists do, we're doing pretty well. Subscription revenue has kept pace or grown. We're at 125,000 digital-only subscribers. That's nearly five-fold growth in 4 years, 44% in just the last year. But that's just a piece of the puzzle. If you can't have that, if you don't have that subscription and advertising mix in traditional media, you're not going to do well.
And also, by the way, when we're talking about subscriptions, Pew Research did something, research in Chicago, I'm sure everybody's familiar with this. 16% of people report that they pay for local news. That means 84% are out there theoretically available to get, but who knows? This is something that was sent to us by Barb Iverson, who was one of our panelists on the last go-around. What does this mean? I mean, Carol, you do your news and give it to people for free on TV, right? But on the other hand, we look all the way down the line here, everybody's trying to get subscriptions, and subscriptions are difficult to get. Anybody?
So, you're right. I mean, for NBC and for TTW, you turn on broadcast or stream it or look at it on your computer and you've got it. I'm a subscriber and I'm a union member, I might also add. The worry about the survival of those of us in this room and on this panel and students of mine that are right over there who we want to say, yes, there's a place for you in news and you will not be on food stamps when you're doing it or having to work a second or a third job, is the crucible in which we exist. I don't have a nice or easy answer, but right now for every student that Don Mosley and I deal with at DePaul, for instance, many of them walk out the door, they've already got a job by the time they're graduating, because there's a hunger for these young people and a hunger for well-trained journalists. But they're pretty much being hired at bare minimum standards, and it's a grievous problem.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think, what Bruce said is right to a degree, that we can blame the duopoly. But I think we're still in the midst of a historic recalibration where for a very long time, certainly in the legacy space, in the print space, a lot of that was subsidized by Sunday advertising, preprint advertising, available on a mass scale. So you're distributing Home Depot, Walmart, Best Buy, Target ads, right? That was really the bread and butter. And now we're leaning more into what the public radio and public broadcasting news shops have depended on for a long time, which is individual support, individual subscribers. At the Chicago Reporter, we're both blessed and cursed that we depend on very large grants from a few important and very generous foundations. But if one of those leaves, we have a huge hole to fill. And so this last year, we've started asking people like you, Ken, and Linda, who have been so nice to support us. And so I think all of us are recalibrating and saying, okay, we can no longer depend on ads, for the majority of our revenue. How much will come from subscriptions? Well, clearly more needs to come from subscriptions. And I think that on some level, we're trying to figure out what people value, how much they value it for, and what they're willing to pay. I'm a Tribune, Sun-Times subscriber. You're welcome. I donate to TTW and WBEZ, ProPublica City Bureau. I donate to my own shop. So we're never going to get to a place where that 84% becomes a 50%, I think. But we've got to close that gap so it's not 16. And I think that that's where we're trying to figure out is how much of the subscriber base will grow. And ultimately, unfortunately, and during my years at Tribune, we heard a lot about right sizing, where we need to right size some of our shops to operate within a new context of means, right? We can't operate how we used to.
And there is also a third component, which is like La Raza and other newspapers we are free. We are distributed free, home delivery or in boxes in the streets. And we heavily still rely on advertising. The print advertising, of course, is mostly dead in the national market, but we still rely in the inserts and coupons and everything that we have to distribute to our readership. But because for reasons during these decades, the 2000s and 2010, there has been a model that, in our case, for example, the Spanish media, La Raza is a newspaper published in Spanish, and it was the case of Hoy and other newspapers in Spanish in the country, that we were, by our corporate, transferred into the free mode. You don't need to pay, you will have some content, and depending, of course, on the level of revenue, of support from your office, corporate office, or if you have other forms of income, you can provide certain amount of content with certain amount of quality that, of course, you always want to produce the best, but then you are forced to start, downsizing. And that is a problem because it's very hard for us to convince the public that, well, you have been receiving this content for free for many years, and the transition into another model that we are now looking at, because I believe that we all believe that the structural and income models of our media are in a big transformation. We are reshaping and rethinking how we can still going on. And in our case, we need, I believe, to find some kind of hybrid model in between the traditional commercial or relying on advertising, because our print will be free. It's very hard to think that we are going to be have a paid circulation. I don't think so. But also we need to start opening our eyes and interactions with other entities like foundations and other corporations that are willing to support media, because in our case, the ethnic media, the media in Chicago and in all the country that is serving very specific populations in different languages, the resources and the opportunities are smaller than for the English media, of course, which is the mainstream media.
Jesus, just because I want to try to get these people in, I know, Ms. Lavelle, you've been wanting to
I
talk.
do.
Before you say anything, let me just say
Yes.
that you are royalty in journalism in Chicago. You
Why?
have
'Cause I'm old. because I'm old? Is that what it is?
No, a lot of us are old.
I don't have
Just being
sense
old.
to quit? Is that what it is?
No, you have published The Crusader for 52 years.
Yeah, I've
You
been
have a
publishing that
perspective.
long, but I've been there 59. And 7 years I was married to the man that owned it. So it kind of tells some of the things. First of all, I want to thank you for having me to come on. I tried to discourage you because I didn't think that I had anything in common with most of these people who are on this panel. I want to thank you for giving me an opportunity. I think this may be the second time I've ever participated in a panel with the Sun-Times, but never with the Chicago Tribune. And I heard you say that it was all about money when you first started. So I said, well, I don't have any comment on that, except to say, welcome to my world, to the Sun-Times and the Tribune. But the Crusader is a newspaper that's different from the mainstream press. It's a niche. Some people want to call it a niche publication. Some want to talk about it as because of its culturalness, and it's true. Our newspaper is not a black Sun-Times or a black Tribune. The Crusader is an advocacy publication. It was founded before the NAACP, the black press was, before the NAACP and so many other organizations in 1873. And makes us 193, 94, I can't count anymore, years old as a press. And it was because there was nothing being printed positive in the mainstream media. We had no way to communicate as African Americans, Negroes, whatever you want to call us. We could not speak to each other. We did not have any mechanism for our news to be available to our community. So the Crusader is totally different from everybody up here, because if it was about money, the Crusader would not be celebrating 80 years this year. I'm here to tell you that. And we will be celebrating in June 12th. There's a little shout out there. But I want you to know that how we have survived 80 years has been the fact that we've always tried to, at the Crusader, small paper, most of the time only 20 pages. But in that 20 pages, we provide something to our community, the black community, that they're not getting in the daily newspapers. We don't try to do a lot of national news. It's community news. And it's been said recently that the community newspapers are doing better than the mainstream papers. They are, they are everything. They're national, they're international, they're everything, the mainstream. And we concentrate on our community. We get, most of our revenue is national advertising. And we have a national advertising representative. Let me just say this, and I know you're going to get to this later on, and I'm going to stop in a moment. But we keep our pages small so that we can pay the printer. We have been in union shops earlier years, in the 60s and the 70s, and it was because there were many newspapers, including the Defender. The Defender had a strike because of a strike back in the 60s. And we were in a union shop, but they didn't really want to do our papers. So they brought in some blacks and all that would print our papers. Well, they didn't have the printing mechanism, but they could make it up and all of that. But I'm going to tell you something. The unions are good. Black people love them because many of us would not have jobs. But it doesn't work for us in our newspapers because we can't afford to pay union wages often. And many of the people who work for us, some of them work free. Some of them get a small pittance. Others, we don't have those high salaries. So we look at that 40-60 kind of combination every week in our paper, and we try to make sure so that we can continue to provide a service to our community. So we're different. So I don't know why I'm up here. But I can tell you right now that it's love and dedication and the need. Even today, we don't do much crime in the Crusader. We try to do things that are inspirational, educational, and the whole bit. And we try to give a spin on news that may be reported in the daily newspapers, how it affects our community. So I know I've been too long on it, but I wanted to bring that point up. I want people to understand that I just need more money and more people, because people
You need more money.
I need more money, but I need
Anybody
more
else at the
people.
panel need more money?
I need more people. I need the money to get more people, because we are called even after hours. People want to subscribe to the paper, especially since the Defender decided not to print anymore.
Which is another thing.
And let me just say this, as chairman of the National Newspaper Publishers Association 3 times, it pained me to see that happen. But the Crusader is here to stay. We are going to publish until we can't publish anymore.
Well, there you go.
Well, let me take a step back. So at the first town hall, John Calloway, one of the greats, said that there was a fundamental difference between online journalism and print journalism, and that the problem with online journalism was that it was theft. Do we, as a panel, agree with that dichotomy, or has that dichotomy ended in the last 10 years? Charlie Meyerson is shaking his head at me.
We disagree with that, and it has ended in the last 10 years. Journalism
Hi,
is
I didn't
journalism
want
is
to
journalism.
interrupt, but I see I have to interrupt because I've been waiting really patiently to ask a question, and you sat there and stood and told
We're
me I
gonna
would
have
be
it.
next.
We're gonna have a Q&A.
I'm going to interrupt right now, actually, because I hear a lot of talking, a lot of meandering conversations, but you're not answering the question straight. My name is Sade Carpenter. I just recently, 2 weeks ago, resigned from my position at the Chicago Tribune as deputy editor for food and dining, as well as editor for Red Eye. I solely put out a publication, 40 to 44 pages weekly, by myself, without support. As Mr. Dold has said, we care so much about advertisers, I have not heard one mention of the community. The only person I heard mention the community was Ms. Lavelle, who's the only one who knows about community-based journalism, the only person who actually produces content for the community that we serve. There are a lot of white men on this panel, and you said that Ms. Lavelle is royalty, but for some reason she was the last person you came to ask a question. I don't know why you didn't speak to her first. So, sorry. And I'm like shaking because I'm kneeling because you didn't let me ask my question when I wanted to, so now I had to take over. So this is what happens when we have to take over.
All right, thank you.
I would advise, I'm not done, so you
Well-
don't need to thank me. Ms. Lavelle, thank you so much for your work. Domity, thank you so much for your work. Please do not waste your advice on them. I see y'all taking notes. You're not going to really listen. You're not going to implement any of these ideas. I was on the organizing committee for the Chicago Tribune Guild. The union members are over here. The only reason the Chicago Tribune is ever going to pay their employees what they're worth is if the Guild fights for it. The Guild is fighting for it. Tribune is talking shit, and they will not do anything. I resigned because I entered a I went on short-term disability. Let's talk about that. I'm not done, and do not touch me. Do not interrupt me.
you.
I am not done. Do not point at me. I am
All right, I'll
not
tell you
done.
what. Let's turn it to
I am
the
going
audience.
to continue
Do you-
talking.
Shall we allow her to continue?
Are you more
Applaud
interested
if
in
you'd
what
like
I'm
her to
saying, or are
continue.
you more interested in the
Okay.
lies that they were telling?
All right, that's good. That's fine. That's fine. Go ahead.
It's not a question. I'm making a statement. Thank you. I know the difference. Okay? Do you know the difference? I'm taking my time. I've reclaimed it. This is on my time. It's really not.
All right.
Pretty sure this was a free event you didn't pay for, so you can leave.
I'm going to ask for this to be ended now.
I'm not going to end it, so you can ask all
you.
you want, but it's not ending.
Yeah.
So when I went on short-term disability because my job exploited me and I wasn't salaried, I made $57,000. I have 2 degrees. I have my journalism degree my bachelor's, I have my master's in journalism. I worked as an intern at 20 whatever just so I can get in the Tribune. There are not many black people in the Tribune. Once you get your foot in the door, you feel like you have to stay there in order to make a way for the other black people who could possibly come after you. You feel like you have to fight for the other journalists of color who are suffering, who are talking about their food stamps and how they can't pay their bills. I applied for food stamps this week. I applied for unemployment this week. I applied for all of these benefits I never thought I'd have to apply for because I went to school. I got the degrees. I got the education. I did what you were supposed to do. But the newspaper exploited me as they continue to exploit all of us. And they will continue to do that. I thought the function of a free press was to uphold. I thought a democracy couldn't exist without a free press. Is this a democracy? Is our press free? Just ask yourself those questions. Now I'm done and you can
Thank you.
continue.
If I may, I want to add just a bit of context to what Sade just mentioned. I think a pleasant byproduct of the downfall of print journalism and where we are right now in terms of, losing these revenue streams is that marginalized upstarts are now being paid attention to. And I think what has happened so long in journalism, and when I started off, I started at WVON AM, and I didn't often feel like voices of color or upstart publications were getting a seat at the table until we began to see mainstream publications struggle financially or struggle in terms of maintaining operations. And so what happened is now you have the Tribe.com, now you have Block Club Chicago, you have all of these upstarts that previously, maybe 10, 15 years ago, established publications wouldn't have looked at them as viable sources for actual information. I mean, there is an elitism that exists within our industry. It's just the truth. And so I think that now that we're seeing that, that these mainstream publications are beginning to struggle, a lot of these upstarts are getting the attention. You wouldn't have seen a partnership between a website like the Tribe.com with more established brands if those established brands were not struggling. And so I think that what Sade kind of touches on gives us, it's kind of a tangential point. We're starting to see a lot of these marginalized publications, a lot of journalists of color, a lot of people who didn't have a seat at the table get seats at the table because mainstream outlets are beginning to understand that it is the key to survival. We have to report on stories, diverse stories, because that's the 84%.
And Bruce.
I want to ask Tracy Bain to talk about that.
Hi. Wow. So I come from queer media, which definitely wasn't respected when I started in 1984. I couldn't work at the Tribune because I was openly gay, and my stepfather worked there and told me, no way, you can make it here, because all his friends who were gay were closeted. So as Dorothy said, we're used to doing things on a dime and being in alt media. So welcome to our world. I was very fortunate a year and a half ago to take over at the Reader, and when I did so, I wanted to implement a lot of things that I didn't get to when I was on a smaller platform. And one of the things is we have launched from the Reader something called the Chicago Independent Media Alliance, and I'm going to just briefly talk about it, and if there are folks in the room that want more, I have business cards up here, because I know we have limited time. But Google and Facebook are the enemy in a big sense, right? But if we don't work together, they will stay the enemy. If we work together, we can fight them and slay the giants, in our town at least. I believe that. I believe they will always be strong, but we can get stronger within our ecosystem of Chicago. We're very fortunate that there's a tremendous amount of resources available here, and we have a geographic landscape that is accessible, and we can do things together. So Chicago Independent Media Alliance, probably about 3 or 4 main mission points. One is to collaborate on a sense of best practices and bring some of the smaller media outlets into the fold in terms of giving them the tools they need to set ad rates and be in ad buys of larger companies. So we had our very first meeting 2 weeks ago, hosted by the Chicago Community Trust at Chalkbeat and Block Club's location downtown. More than 70 folks were there, more than 50 media outlets were represented. We believe that we can go to corporations and have clout together. We believe that we can pressure the government to be more equitable in its placement of advertising. We're modeling this on a program in New York where CUNY, New York, pressured Bill de Blasio to issue an executive order to say that 50% of spending from government agencies has to go to community and ethnic media. It's shifting millions of dollars in great ways. It's just starting, but we're hoping to model after that. And we also think that we can work on joint editorial projects together that are possibly grant funded, whether you're for-profit or nonprofit. We got a first grant from the McCormick Foundation of $50,000. 26 outlets are splitting that evenly to do original reporting on the U.S. Census. So if we come together, I think we have clout, and that includes independent outlets like the Sun-Times, all the way down to Ergo podcast and all sorts of ones in between. 1,000 people listening to Ergo podcast, to me, has as great a value sometimes as 100,000 people reading a daily newspaper. It just depends on who wants to reach that audience. So we need to have a more equitable placement of advertising, government resources, as well as editorial collaborations to help make sure that we don't continue to see the failure of community media, who I believe provide an authentic community voice, that if we lose that, it's almost as great, if not greater, than losing some of the more mainstream outlets out there.
I'll take a point of personal privilege and point out that the Daily Line is partnering with Chalkbeat and La Raza and The Reporter to do our Lens on Lightfoot program, as well as The Tribe. And I think that's really what you're talking about, right? That we're stronger together as opposed to working at cross purposes sometimes. Right. And we partner quite often with Block Club. And it's what I like to call co-opetition, right? Mm-hmm. We cooperate when we can and we compete when we want to. But I think sort of a fundamental question that a lot of us have been talking about lately is, can those small independent media organizations, if the worst case scenario for the Tribune happens or the Sun-Times or legacy media, can we fill whatever gap is left? Or is that gap unfillable? And I don't know the answer to that question.
I mean, I think we don't want anybody to leave.
Right.
We don't want to lose anybody, and I think that, every day I see Greg Pratt's 6 bylines from City Hall is, we're happy that the Tribune is still there. When we see your 6 bylines from City Hall, because we also subscribe to the Daily Line, I think...
You see France 24? France
Yes.
Oh, snap! Hold on.
Just
Can
a little
Fusco
joke,
just drop
had
the
to cut
mic?
the
He
tension
just
a
dropped
little
the
bit.
mic.
I think one of the things that may end up happening is, I see it as unbundling, and sort of like the newspaper was cable, and we're all sort of individual subscription services, and like some of us you pay for, and some of us you don't pay for, and some of us get to survive because of the folks who are paying for us. And so we may not end up having a beer critic in 2021 who's working at the Tribune, right? But you see it happening with The Athletic moving into sports. You guys are clearly into City Hall. La Raza's, holding down the Spanish language areas. And so I think that you'll end up having Chalkbeat with WBZ's education team. You just, as a news consumer, you will start to gravitate toward those things. When you're a subscriber to Block Club and you see a Daily Line story, it creates those affinities where you can see, I'm really into education, or I'm really into politics, or I'm really into this particular community, this neighborhood. And so you'll have something that we didn't have, which is a sort of granular richness, but it won't be cable for $180 a month.
So I want to ask Chris Fusco at the Sun-Times had no paywall for many, many years, now has a paywall. How do you convince people to pay for something that they had been getting for free?
Well, first
Besides
of all,
pointing to Franz Spielman.
Start by going to suntimes.com/subscribe. It's $30 a year, as my CEO Nakia Wright likes to say.
$30 a year?
$30 a year.
You gotta
and
be
subscribe
kidding.
digitally.
See, that's gonna be the problem. Mine is $35 a year. Already, they're underselling us. Okay, sometimes. But let me just say this, Chris. It has been, and I want to acknowledge that young lady. You're absolutely right, baby, that they're going to take notes, and they're going to do what I'm doing, and they have the money to do it. But because the Sun-Times and the Tribune, they're getting a little blacker. They still do, they slam us in it. But This is the growth market. Our black community is the growth market. I shouldn't be telling you that because you've already realized it, and you're doing a lot more than what you used to do. But you got big money behind you to make it happen.
But
and I
we
just
have-
want to bring up DNA info. That was another experiment in capitalizing on our communities, and it didn't work. They had big money. They had big money. They were in every community, every black community in the city. They were in there. They couldn't continue to do it. And I got into a big fight with somebody, I mean, he may be on this panel, about a black reporter that gave a story. He was unscrupulous. He gave us both the same story. I thought the guy was a freelancer. And he said, oh no, he's on our staff, and wanted me to take down all the stories that the guy had written and all of that, and I refused to do it. I would not do it. I'm not taking anything down. I paid for what I paid for. If you don't like it, take yours down. So anyway, I just had to bring that up. And young lady, we can't pay you what they were paying you at the Tribune, but I can tell you one thing. We have a place for you at the Crusader. Come and see us.
So I think trying to sort of answer your question, Heather, while trying to wrap a lot of things in.
Sorry.
Why should folks subscribe to the Sun-Times? I think we're trying to build a lot of bridges back. I think you talked about our near-death experience here in 2017. We don't know how that would have worked out, but we were able to get. We did a lot of experimentation. We've been able to get more folks in the door. We'll still nowhere. We're probably closer to the ranks of the Crusader in terms of staff than we are to Bruce's operation. But we're out there trying to build those bridges back, and we know we have a long way to go on diversity. We've got a tremendously long way to go. But in terms of our coverage paradigm, when we were near that near-death experience, the only news about communities of color that was really getting in our paper outside of what Mary Mitchell was doing was crime news. And we saw that. One of the first things I did after becoming managing editor was approach Maud, who's going to be on the panel later on. We started Chicago Chronicles. That built a bridge back. We went out and we got Report for America funding, hired Manny Ramos and Carlos Ballesteros, and that's building a bridge back. So while our newsroom is not reflective of the region in terms of diversity, we're hoping that when we walk into those news meetings every day, it's top of mind, and our daily news report, regardless of who the color of the person producing that story, does reflect the diversity of the region. Do we make mistakes? Do we screw up? Absolutely. There is not a person in this room that is in this industry that has not made a mistake. But overall, I think the mentality that we have is we're trying to get it right. And I think we're doing it with our story selection, and hopefully that moves forward in terms of our hiring practices going down the road. That's reason number one. Reason number two is it's cheap. Reason number three is we provide a vital community service. Reason number four is we're trying to build a bridge back regionally again, and I think we're trying to do it through sports. We know that if we can get readers in the region to come back to us and subscribe digitally, we'll get the funds that we need. And yes, Dorothy, I need money too. We all of us in this industry spent a lot of years, I think, spending money we didn't have. And the beauty of where we're at, I feel, as a news organization now, and it could all end tomorrow, okay? And let's make no mistakes.
The truth for all of us. Let's be real.
That's right. We're not guaranteed another breath on this planet, let alone in this business. But
You know something about that. You worked at DNA Info.
Speak of the devil.
I guess going.
Was that you, Chris, that I had to fuss with?
No, it wasn't me, ma'am.
But no, what we're trying to do is get folks back in the door and build a regional publication again that people see as necessary for their daily lives. And we'll see. I'm pleased with where we're headed, but I know we've got a long way to go.
What's happening right now in the industry kind of reminds me of what happened in the music industry with Napster and with free music. So we know that people value this content. News stories are going viral all the time. The problem is, I don't know if there's a subscription model that makes sense for my generation and younger that they can buy into. So what happened with to use the music industry example, then you had, Apple Music, and now you got you got Spotify, you got Tidal, you got all these streaming services where you pay a subscription and you get all the music you want. I don't know if the folks from the business end of this business could say if this is viable or not, but if I pay $30 a year for my Sun-Times subscription, I pay X for my Tribune subscription, then for my New York Times, then for all of that. Now I'm 200.
What happened to the Crusader?
Oh, I already got that one. I got that one. You know that. I got that in 95.
She's got her eye on you.
I don't want no problems with Miss Lavelle. But all these subscriptions, and then what does a model look like? Is this viable? Is it practical? Where you pay $20 a year for everything. And I think that is the thing that we're missing. Everyone is working in our silos, and everyone wants the content, they want the information, but it's not easy to figure out how to get it from all these publications at once.
So I'll credit Melissa Sanchez of ProPublica Illinois, who I was talking with before the thing, and she said that Chicago sort of had organically become the largest quasi-news cooperative in the country organically, right? We're all working together, we're all talking together, we're not fighting if we don't have to fight. But the business sides of the Tribune and the Sun-Times and the Daily Line and everything, they're not talking to each other. And the Crusader, excuse me. I see you, I see you.
You're gonna get a
So how do we get, so we don't have any answers for the business side of things, and that's a problem, right?
Well, I think that's what we're trying to do with SEMA. And it does include any independent, so it would include the Sun-Times, and sometimes Chris was at our meeting a couple weeks ago. Sorry to say it wouldn't include the Tribune with Alden Capital, but other than that, it includes a lot of folks.
Oh, hey, look, it's the elephant in the room.
So I do think you're right. I mean, that's what we need. Our dream, and I don't know if Karen Hawkins is here yet, but our co-editor-in-chief's dream is a huge independent media center on the south side where all the back ends of all our independent organizations are shared. The advertising, the business, the HR, the union negotiations, all of that. And then the front end, the editorial is free to do what they need to do. And so we put that out in the universe because there are rich people who like to name buildings, and that could be a possibility. But short of that, there are definitely things happening now, and it may be small scale to start, but if we can show success, I believe it will grow and scale.
So I want to bring Cassie from Chalkbeat in. They have a nonprofit model, which is sort of the other side of things that we haven't talked a little bit about. How has that worked being the founding editor of the Chicago Bureau?
Sure. So I spent 18 years in for-profit journalism, and so 2 years ago came over to the nonprofit side. And so Chalkbeat is a national news nonprofit headquartered in New York. And so we have bureaus. We have a bureau model, and I opened the Chicago Bureau. And in the next, by 2025, we're looking to actually double in size, so add more than 7 other cities. Which is really exciting. So, for the nonprofit side, I will say, some of the words that we use on the for-profit side, so subscriptions, they're similar words on the nonprofit side, we just use a different word, right? Membership. They're not advertisers, they're sponsors. And so there's some of the same tensions and I think things and problems that exist, but there's also a lot of opportunities. And one thing that really strikes me is that in the for-profit world, I never knew what the financials were, like the real financials. I worked for Chicago Magazine, which was owned by the Tribune most of the time, and then I worked at Crane Chicago Business, which is privately held. And I never knew the financials. I never really knew what the money was. There was kind of a proxy for it. At Chalkbeat, I know the financials. I know, I have a very open line to the CEO. I'm part of the conversations about the growth plan and where we should go. And I think that it's just very different to have that sort of sense that the editorial team has a voice in the business operations. I think that feels very different to me. I also think that thinking about, we don't use competition. We don't think about competition in the same way. So we're part of a partnership with you, and
we partnered on a story just this week because we had a reporter in Springfield and they didn't, and they needed to ask the mayor a question about something going on in Springfield.
Right, and it went down in about 9 minutes, right?
Exactly.
So,
all over text.
Right,
Very,
and
very professional.
Very professional. But I think that thinking about some of these things really differently and really challenging our thinking. I think right now at Chalkbeat, we're doing, for example, a source audit. So we're not just talking about diversity in our newsroom in terms of our reporters, but who are the people we're talking to? Who are the people we're featuring when we're reaching out to principals and when we're reaching out to teachers? Are we just reaching out to white teachers? Or are we just reaching out to white principals? And that doesn't represent the community nor the school system. And so really thinking about those things and being very intentional about it is something that we're trying to do. And the last thing I'll just say is that in terms of building a nonprofit media center, we've also joined forces with Block Club and some of the data organizations in town to start an open government collaborative. And so we have basically co-working space, but that is everybody in the space is connected to open government in some sort of way. Again, sharing a newsroom with another news organization, maybe not something that people would have thought to do 10 and 20 years ago. We have to because of the financial realities. I can't afford rent for my shop just in and of itself. Well, I can, but in a terrible space. But so we have a really nice new space. And so I think just thinking about where we can lean on each other.
Heather, if I can just, 11 years ago when Ken and Linda conceived of this, I think Rob Feeder and I may be the last remainders of that panel 11 years ago, and we were the old legacy guys at that time. And there were a lot of new digital, really exciting projects that were sitting at this table too, talking about how news needed to continue to be reinvented. The tricky thing, and I think that that you and I especially agree on this, foundations are wonderful things. They lose interest after about 5 years and go to something new. Competition and collaboration is phenomenal, and we do an awful lot of it in this day and age. But competition also brings something too. And a capitalist model, I'm sounding like Elizabeth Warren here, but also has some value in that competition and having loyal subscribers or loyal readers or loyal viewers so that you're not constantly reinventing yourself every 5 years. What ended up happening 11 years ago to now is a lot of those startups just couldn't monetize, couldn't survive, couldn't maintain. They couldn't hire lawyers when they were sued. And so in a sustainable economy, I think we all are interested in doing that in behalf of news and still struggling to figure out what that is today.
Well,
This is as much, by the way, I just want to take issue with the fundamental statement that we heard at the beginning, that this is about money. Yeah, money's a nice thing to have, but I think the most important issue that we all face is audience. If you have a big audience, then you have money. And as Tracy said in another context, this is as much as anything about getting the advertising industry to recognize the value of small but real and engaged audiences.
I want to go
And I
to,
want to add
just
something to this. I want to add something because it's very viable. If you can recall when they had set-asides and women, black people would get a set-aside because of the inequities and all of that, we found that a lot of white women got very rich because they came under that same rule that they would be considered a minority, so to speak. And I can see the same thing happening here. The census that we are all gearing up to, they did a tremendous ad buy. Tremendous. I happened to see a list. There were all kinds of radio stations that said that they were black. Now, they are black, and they may be black-oriented, some of them, but they're not black-owned, and they are benefiting from that. I didn't see WVON on there. I'm sure that Melody took care of her own thing. And then what's missing on this panel now is that we do have a couple online people sitting in the audience out there I'd just like to recognize that are doing a great job with their online presence. Now, the Crusader is in print, online, and we have social media. We need to beef it up as much as we can. Again, I said it was people. But we have Hermine Hartman from Indigo, who's sitting out there. And we have Carl West from TBT News. Stand up, Carl. And I don't see the Citizen here. The Citizen is still in print, and that's why I said it was at least 2 black prints. So now Ms. Hermine's got
Dorothy, I want to piggyback off of something you said in that we have kind of had this experience before. At one time, there used to be something called affirmative action, and it started for minorities, of which black folks used to be. And now we are all people of color.
Yeah.
As all of you here are in the media, I think the New York Times must have invented the people of color. Washington Post, when Barack was president, did the post-racial. This is breaking news. There ain't no post-racial.
Okay.
And for damn sure, we ain't people of color. You are either African American, you are Mexican or Puerto Rican or Cuban, but we need to stop this people of color thing. Because in the whole identity, like Dorothy just told y'all about the census, they got a people of color box for advertising. They don't have the people of color box for the count. And one thing that you all could do as you look at the panel that is damn near white, lily white, the people of color is probably your growth area.
It is.
And if you would include us in a big way, you would probably see some rise in your products. I have been with the Tribune, and I'm indebted forever to the Tribune and with the Sun-Times. I had a little different kind of business model. But we are not, there is still racism in this media. There is still need for the Crusader. The story, if you read the Crusader and you read the Tribune and you read the Sun-Times, you see a tale of two cities. It is illustrated. You read me, you read Carl, we're talking about different things. And of late, we've looked at Blagojevich coming out of jail. Black folks got a whole different reaction. It's like he's two people, like he's a Jekyll and Hyde, as to how we perceive. These perceptions and these opinions that we have, they're very valuable, and we need to all embrace them. The way black folks look at Biden and North Carolina is very different the way somebody else, the way they look at poor Bernie, Trump. I mean, we're just all over, my God, we all over the place, aren't we? But the people of color thing, that's the thing I want to say about, because that is becoming, it's a misnomer. It's wrong. And for some of us, a lot of black folks take insult to it. And I just wanted to point that out to the larger Chicago media community. Thank you.
No doubt about it. Thank you.
I was just going to say, I think we're coming up on time, and I wanted to give Robert Feeder a chance to inject himself into this maelstrom.
Hey, Rob, what's happening? What's
Thank you,
happening
Ellen.
in media in Chicago, Rob?
11 years ago, when we convened here, the consensus was that the financial model, the former financial model of the journalism business was broken, and it's still broken. What we acknowledged also was that we had made a big mistake by giving away content for free online too long, and we created the expectation among consumers that news was free and that they shouldn't have to pay for it. And we've been trying to fight our way back ever since. What we have now is an opportunity for people to create their own media diet based upon all of the digital entities that exist in specialized ways, so that you can now create your own daily diet of publications and websites and newsletters, and if you are diligent at it and are willing to devote the resources to it, you can remain very well informed. Newspapers can no longer be all things to all people. They can't serve all of your news dietary needs every day as they used to, and that's the environment we find ourselves in. The other mistake that I think we're making now, and I think we're going to continue to pay the price for it, is we're failing to, I think, adequately respond to those who would demean and diminish what we do, what journalism is, what it's supposed to be. And I think the consequences of that are grave moving forward. And when it comes directly from the White House, And when it comes from Rush Limbaugh, who has made a career out of disparaging what he calls the drive-by media, which is actually legitimate news media, legitimate professional journalism. And when that message is reinforced every night to 3 million viewers of Fox News, we have a problem. And I see it reflected in the comments to my blog from people who reflexively see everything through this distorted lens of what we do and what journalism is. And it pains me that no one has been able to mount an effective response in the way that I can still recall Walter Cronkite speaking truth to Spiro Agnew in 1969 when he rallied our whole profession to say, no, this isn't right. And it's much more difficult to do so today. And I think that is going to have as grave a consequence as the financial problems are that we've been discussing up to now. I would hope that that would be something that we could address as well. Let me just get a brief plug-in for my employer, the Daily Herald, which has embarked on a series of public seminars where they go to schools and libraries and community groups to explain how journalism works, to explain how we do our jobs. And when a big story happens, a big story breaks for the Daily Herald, a day or two later, the editor in charge or the reporter in charge will write a TikTok story explaining to readers how the story came to the newsroom, how they responded, how they were mobilized, how the story appeared in print, what the choices that were made. Things like that could go a long way, I think, in helping win back the understanding and the loyalty of readers that we depend on. And I think in a broad sense, it all gets down to media literacy, and that, I think, is one of the great failings of our profession in the last 20 years.
Rob makes some really good points.
That's right.
One is that, yeah, our credibility has been undermined by concerted efforts, but we also have to safeguard it by being objective. And that includes being objective in our use of social media, on our pages, everywhere we go, to make sure that we're not undermining ourselves. The second, to go back to something that Carol said about the foundations, it is a frustration to me, because I've talked to just about every foundation in town, and they do seem to have kind of that 5-year window and then losing interest. They have not shown much interest in sustainability, and I think that should also include sustainability of legacy news media. And I think maybe one way to do it is to do the kind of partnerships that we're talking about here that we haven't done much. We've been really pleased with our work with ProPublica. Our BEZ project in 16 Shots was really great work. But I understand there are many more potential partners up here. But just a word to the foundation folks,
Including
think about
the black
whole
press.
diet.
Well,
Including the black press.
But
They
there
all
are
should
some
be doing that
foundations,
too.
most of the foundations that support our projects are focused on nonprofits, of course, because it's the typical way. But there are some that are now opening their interest to for-profit media that are serving specific markets or doing specific projects, like La Raza, like the Tribe, others that we have support, for example, from the Field Foundation. And there are others, for example, the Borealis Philanthropies, which have money from several other entities. They are doing a big program to support the operation and sustainability for community media, but they are reluctant to support media that are part of larger corporations because they believe that they want to focus on small, non-profit or for-profit, but then in a smaller scale or with a specific focus. But this is also true that the new conditions of the whole thing need that big and small and foundations and advertisers, and as you mentioned, Facebook and Google, we need to find ways to restructure our whole model in order to be sustainable, the small, the larger, because each one have a role to have, a part to contribute to the whole environment. If, of course, only the big ones survive, we will have some problem, but also if the great corporations in size and in capabilities are struggling with, I don't know, but problems of focusing their content, separating with the other sources of funding or whatever, or if the lack of resources to keep a proper newsroom with good salary levels and in eroding the content, eroding the quality, or in conflict, everything at the end will diminish to the journalism and the profession. And it's something that from every size and from every part of our environment, we need to discuss and try to solve. No?
You know, it's, sorry, who did I just cut somebody off? It just happens that we have someone from the McCormick Foundation here. Andre Torres, I'm sure the panelists want to ask you some questions. But is it true? Do foundations get interested for a year or two and then sort of they get disinterested?
So I'm not going to try to speak for all foundations. That's probably beyond my purview. But what I can say, and I think that it'd be helpful just to clarify from the McCormick Foundation's relationship with journalism, our relationship, our focus is on trying to fill information gaps. So our loyalty is to the citizen, him, her, themselves, is making sure that that person has information that person needs to make an informed decision and participate in democracy. There are a lot of ways to get there, and I think there's an interesting constellation of outlets that can help deliver that information, but ultimately we measure our success based on the level of information and level of inclusion in that information across the region. That means that, you know, in terms of practical activities, we're supporting certain outlets that are meeting certain gaps. There are times that we are supporting some organizations for only a few years. There are others, and many of them are in this room, that have enjoyed support from foundations for decades. The question, I think, is more of how are we understanding the full needs of people and thinking about that in a much more inclusive way than has been traditionally defined of the audience for media. So we're making a specific push to understand what do communities on, you know, if we're thinking about a segregated city like Chicago, what do communities on the South and West Side need? If we're thinking in terms of linguistic access, what do communities who prefer to access their information in a language other than English need? How are we meeting those gaps? And I think everybody in this room is a part of the solution. What we're really thinking about as we think about our relationship with other foundations, though, is how do we bring more resources into this space? The McCormick Foundation is not the answer. We can be part of it. But it's about building a mix. It's about allowing outlets to experiment so they can figure out what is working. And then as some experiments don't work, what do we learn from them so we can use that to inform future iterations of organizations. But what we're thinking about in partnership with other organizations like the MacArthur Foundation, like the Joyce Foundation, like the Chicago Community Trust is, okay, we have established programs that do support journalism. How do we help other foundations see that? But then also how do we, and in terms of our work, serve as ambassadors to perhaps the philanthropic business community, the philanthropic individual philanthropists, to try and make sure that we are bringing more resources into this. At the end of the day, I think if we look at sectors like the arts, philanthropy is also making its adjustment. 15 years ago, the idea that philanthropy would be part of the bottom line for some organizations in perpetuity was not expected. Foundations are still making that transition to try and understand what is our role in media and is it enduring? And we, because we've had such an enduring commitment to journalism, do see that as being an important part of our work. We're trying to help others see that as well.
I'm sure it differs by project, but I just had a really quick question. How do you gauge the success of an experiment? Like, what does success look like for a news shop experiment?
It really depends on the project. So I think that an example that has been mentioned a couple times is the Lens on Lightfoot project that is engaging 7 different outlets and trying to leverage their complementary audiences and their complementary focuses. I think there are a couple of ways we might define success for that project. One, what are we learning about how to work together as we're realizing that in an era of extreme change, our outlets finding collaboration to actually be something that is better serving them and better serving audiences, then we might also ask, what do audiences need? So how are we working with researchers to understand what information people need, how are they getting it, and are these collaborations actually helping to bring information that wouldn't otherwise be accessible to them? So those are just two metrics that we might
So
consider.
speaking of the lens on Lightfoot, I want to bring Tiffany from the tribe into this conversation.
Thank you. I first want to acknowledge Sade if she's still in the room, and I encourage everyone here to give a round of applause for her for being brave and speaking her truth. And I also encourage people to put yourself in her position and put yourself in the position of journalists who are losing their jobs, who are having to resign, who are having to take these buyouts, and understand how much of a difficult choice that is. I used to work at a Tribune company in Orlando. I worked at the Orlando Sentinel, and I saw buyouts happen. I used to work at Ebony Magazine as an intern, and I saw people pack up and leave, and I know what that experience is like. So it's not easy for her to get up here and have this conversation. In a newsroom, you're not often heard. You just get these emails, and then you're gone. So please find in your heart to have some compassion for her as she got up here and spoke. In terms of what's going on with media here in Chicago and with foundations, it's great to receive, support from the foundations here, but it also would be great too to see, more operational funding and support as well. We've been a part of Shy.Vote. We're a part of Lens on Lightfoot now. We get emails all the time about applying to join, different collaborations because that's in season now. We get a lot of emails about applying for grants for stories and things like that. But, we're a two-person operation. We can't apply for 10 grants solely about telling a story and 2 people put out stories. If Black Press, if La Raza, if folks had opportunities to receive operational funding and hire these staff, we will be able to put out more of the content, and our ideas would be able to be brought to fruition in a larger light instead of us out here doing the groundwork and doing the community work here, and then we see people get the funding and then they come and do the ideas that we already have been doing from jump. And we're standing on the legacy of Indigo and TBT and Crusader and Defender and everybody else who's been doing this work for years. So for me, it's more so about supporting the operation of an organization, of a community organization, instead of coming in giving $2,000-$3,000 to write a story. That money's gone, and then we're back to square one of figuring out how to uplift our communities, or watching someone else try to come in and uplift our communities because they have the funding or they have the clout or they have the name behind them. So those are my 2 thoughts.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you. We're down to like our last 15 minutes, and I know there's so much else we want to talk about, but I don't know, Heather, I thought maybe since we've kind of backed into this conversation about how news operations are funded, and we have the call for there to be an acknowledgement of capitalism and the fact that audiences bring money. I think that's a very important issue that we have to discuss. And I just wonder if Tracy might lead off with this to talk about not-for-profit. You guys have taken the Reader nonprofit.
Well, we've applied. We'll see if the IRS likes us or not on it. It's an unknown.
Come on, IRS.
Yeah, so we have our application in. I think we did as best a job as we can to make the case for it. The Reader's always been free in print and online, and the kind of journalism it does. But so hopefully we will get there. And as Carol said, we don't want a single point failure of one revenue stream. We've got about 10 revenue streams, and that will be one of them. One of the things I wanted to address, Tiffany and I were talking a little bit beforehand, is that community media actually has been a very viable source for funding for people other than us for a long time, and that's the academic institutions in Chicago who get millions of dollars in grants from places like the Knight Foundation to study us and probe us and put a study on the shelf that never has any money that implements actually what we said were great ideas. So it's very frustrating to be in an environment where we're asked for our expertise constantly, but then the resources don't come to us, they come to the academic institutions or others. So I think at SEMA, we were talking about it, I think that's one of the things we want to confront on that. You want our time, you pay us. Our rate will be $100 an hour, and we're happy to talk to folks that want to learn more about what we're doing. We also want the foundations to step up in Chicago that aren't funding journalism. So as Andre said, there really only are a handful of foundations in Chicago that actually are the bread and butter for most of the journalism funding. Those 5 foundations got together. The Reader co-hosted with them a forum in November with McCormick, MacArthur, Field Foundation, the Trust, Forefront, and I think there was one other. And 20 foundations attended to learn about how they might tiptoe into this space that have never funded journalism before. That's where the big money is, especially in the donor-advised funds at the Chicago Community Trust, of which I think there's over $1 billion in assets. There are people that get tax write-offs to shelter their money in these family foundations, and we need to use our clout to unleash that money. If they care about education, they need to fund the journalists to cover that education. If they care about criminal justice reform, et cetera. So I think if we push together, it's not going to be a heavy lift, because I think they do want to weigh in. They want to figure out a path to this without the pain that might come from getting into a whole new other area of funding. And what I think that's going to be, and I hope it will be, is a pooled fund for journalism at the Chicago Community Trust. There's a study going on that MacArthur is funding at the Trust to see if it's viable to create a pooled fund for journalism. What it allows is for foundations who don't want to create a program officer and a whole new funding stream, they can put their money into a pooled fund, and someone else will do the labor of reading through the grant applications, understanding the liabilities and all of that, and funding journalism. We need more money because we need a much bigger pie. We are not going to survive if the pie stays stable in what it is now. Again, funders can come in and out of this space, but if there's 100 people, 100 foundations funding into it and individual donors, that pooled fund is also less of a single point failure. So that is the dream, and I hope it's a reality by 2021, because we're such a precarious point. We're going to lose a lot more media in the next 12 to 24 months if we don't have it operational.
You know, one thing I'd add here too is that I think, and Tracy said it in responding to what Carol said, is that I don't know of anybody running a nonprofit newsroom who's solely thinking about foundations and solely thinking about grant support. You can't. And I don't think that nonprofit newsrooms are the opposite of capitalism. I think that we are doing things and trying to grow other revenue streams, and Tracy mentioned this as well. But what are some other ways that we can raise money, raise support? And I think the membership model is really interesting. So how do we think about what readers want? How do we have events and members get first access to those events and they're willing to pay for that? Event sponsorships are another place. So I would just stress that I don't think foundations are very important, and they're certainly a big part of our revenue model, but the plan is to change that over time. And that's where I think a lot of interesting conversation should be happening. How do we change that and work together? And it's not anti-capitalist.
There's a dilemma I've been battling with as a consultant, and I've been just from a distance watching digital upstarts battle with this as well, that I'm curious to know what you guys who have decades of experience think about this. In terms of operational funding, when corporations pay a publication to do a story on a topic of interest to that corporation, even if the news story is objective, if it's solid journalism, it's marred by, it has this asterisk because this story was sponsored by XYZ. How do we feel about that? How do we balance that, and how do we use that as a viable revenue stream while protecting the integrity of the stories we tell?
We don't.
Okay. And guess what? I agree with that. My reluctance, I'm not 100%. I was chairman of the Reader. I want to get it clear out here. People were saying I bought it. I don't have enough money to buy anything. But I was chairman of the board of the Reader. And it was a decision by those who own it to become a not-for-profit. I'm not 100% sold. I don't think the Crusader would ever be that, because I do value the opportunity to print what I know as the truth and not be sponsored. We have done some unusual kinds of things at the Crusader that has given us new life. And please don't copy this down. But we have a young man who we found out didn't have real good sense. He came from Miami to Chicago. He hunted me down to hire him, and it's been a godsend. His name is Eric Johnson. Eric has done some fantastic things at the Crusader. One thing he did, he found the grave of the original Aunt Jemima, and it ended up that she had been buried at Oakwood Cemetery when they didn't bury black people. So obviously it was whomever she worked for had manipulated, but she didn't have a headstone, and she still doesn't. It's a convoluted thing to try to get one on there. You have to find a family member. Then he did another thing. There was a black guy from Chicago who was training and getting ready to go on the next space travel. And he was training another pilot, and the pilot killed him virtually. I mean, and not like that, but he was piloting the plane, and this gentleman got killed in that plane. And what was so unusual is that they don't honor you unless you go out of space. You're not called an astronaut. But he had given so many years of his life in working for this position. Well, guess what? For people who say nobody reads The Crusader and some of our other publications, the University of Illinois picked it up and honored this man, invited his family to come down to Champaign. And if that wasn't enough, they sent a message and found Eric, and they honored him at NASA down in Florida and invited the family. So we have a great deal of value. We have been devalued all of our years of existence. But we had, and that's just two of the little stories. This week I was telling Carol Marine, and my husband and I brought some papers and then so busy trying to get in here, left them in the car. But this week, with our former governor being released from prison, our headline is not like anybody else's. We wanted, the people in our community wanted to know who was that black man that was standing on the steps, who was putting up that sign, and all of that. His name was Ziv Sistrunk.
Oh, I wanted to know that too.
Okay, well, that was our headline. Who's that black guy with Blagojevich? And that was the interest. And of course, in this story, we told the story about the indictment and all of that. But our headline said, who was this black guy that was with Blagojevich? So we, like I say, we are not trying to copy after other people. If you have an article of benefit to all of the citizens of Chicago, we feel it's our responsibility to say how it affects our community. Not how it affects Lincoln Yards and some of those other places. We are interested in our own community. And let me just say this, we don't say enough about all of this stuff that's on the internet. And I know I'm old, and everybody be talking about me, but it's all right. We should never let so much of a campaign of misinformation unseat us as newspapers. We should not let it happen, because that's what's happening. Everybody and his grandmother, I almost said mother, that say something like that, and his grandmother's on the internet writing their own thoughts, wrong or right.
Can I take off from that?
Yes, you can.
I think you've hit on a very important point.
Yeah.
And I think in the last few minutes we've got left, it's impossible to deal with something this big. But how does the Tribune, how does Chicago Public Square deal with the fact that you are up against this behemoth of Facebook, the triad? How are you going to deal with it? Okay, you got name checked. Go, Charlie.
Email, independent of those behemoths. As I started to say earlier, audience is everything, and every organization here should be working as hard as they can to build a direct connection to their audience, to their readers. Email, so far at least, until Gmail decides to tweak things, is as direct a connection as you can get. Build that connection, build that audience, then monetize the hell out of it through advertising, reader support, and all the rest.
Yeah,
Bruce.
ease of use and understanding your audience. And I think we're getting better and better at understanding the audience. But I think we also, and I was talking about political advertising. We don't get much political advertising. Couldn't figure out why.
Thank God for Bloomberg.
Anyway, I talked to a political operative in town that I have, who's very good, who said you have too many high information voters.
Huh.
And he said that because you have readers who want to argue, but they're not that persuadable. And they're looking for, so they're looking for platforms with advertising. They'll put it everywhere. And they'll find people who feel an obligation to vote, and the last message they heard may be the one that they listen to. So that means, all right, we have a great quality of audience, and we're building that audience, but we just need vastly more audience. And part of that comes is understanding them better.
You hear a lot of talk in media now about newsletters, and
Everybody's doing newsletters all of a sudden.
well, I mean, it's sort of the new front page, right? Because the problem with the internet, on top of it stealing all of our money, is
that.
it's an echo chamber, right? If I want to read X story about, I can find 14 stories to verify whatever point that I want to make myself hear. And the beauty of the newspaper is that it challenges you every day. I think a lot of folks, police, firefighters, our audience at the Sun-Times, they pick up the thing every morning and they slam it down because they're angry at us. But we challenge them, and they keep coming back. The newsletter, I think, is going to be our way forward, and we're doing a morning, afternoon. Go ahead, Carol.
To Rob Feder's point, though, Chris, I think we in media, in all media, do a terrible job of educating our own readers about our differences. Can't tell you how many times I have to explain NBC News manual rules and regulations and MSNBC's differences. You know, we do not teach, and we need to start this in kindergarten, the difference between the editorial page and the news page, the difference between a columnist, a commentator, and a reporter. We don't do that. We take for granted that people understand our differences, and they don't. And it's on us to be the explainer of our own business.
Yeah, we hear that a lot we hear the Tribune, you know, like, I don't read the Tribune because you've got all these liberal, you know, you got Eric Zorn working for you or something, so I don't like the Tribune. And that's the point, is that there is this difference, and that's being lost somehow. I'm sorry, I cut somebody off. No,
I was going to say I completely agree with Carol, and that distinction becomes significantly reduced. A physical paper has like essentially a section where that kind of stuff is presented.
Yeah.
As digital media is metered out across different places, those distinctions break down, and
Absolutely.
as newspapers are less and less. I mean, my father's actually here, and I remember him explaining to me the difference between an editorial and a news article when I was 7, 8, 9, 10. And as newspapers are less and less a part of, you know, your average growing up experience, as more and more people read different sources of news, the news literacy is just going to be gone. I mean, that's just a reality of the fact. We can, you know, hem and haw and oh, woe is us, but like we need to acknowledge the reality.
In a Facebook tweet or a Facebook feed or a Twitter feed, it all looks the same.
Very much, oftentimes, yes. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Since that distinction is so blurry, what does it mean to have a corporation sponsor a piece of content, even if you tell the viewer that's what they're reading?
You don't do it.
You don't do it at all.
You don't do it.
It doesn't serve the, I mean, that's a longer discussion. It doesn't serve corporations well. You wind up with content that nobody's interested in except the corporation.
Well, I could see this as a project for all these wealthy people sitting here at this table, that we could work together to try to educate the reader as to is somebody's opinion and not necessarily the opinion of the newspaper, and that news articles that have been investigated and put forth. So, you know, I mean, it can really happen. Who would believe? I mean, my husband, who died in 1968, would never believe that the Sun-Times and the Tribune would be here at the table with the Crusader. So, I mean, you know, need brings about a lot. I just want to put it on your mind. And maybe that ought to be something we ought to do together to make sure that our readers are cognizant of what we are.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Last couple of minutes.
No, I was just going to say Bruce. I cut Bruce off. I just want
Oh, that's
to
all
give you
right.
back the floor.
I would love someday to put all the people who think the Tribune's too liberal in a room with all the people who think the Tribune's too conservative and let them hash it out. Because you try and have that great clash of ideas, but I don't know if it's the best business model to be an equal opportunity offender. Because at some point you do tick off everybody. But we're still going to keep doing that. I think that's still one of the great purposes of the paper, is to have that be a place that has that clash of ideas.
Yeah.
one of the
There
things
has
we-
been this cliche over the years. In my time at the Tribune, those of us in the rank and file came to object to it. Right sizing. It was a euphemism for layoffs. But over the years, I've come to see there's some fundamental truth in that. There is a right size for news organizations in the 21st century. It's probably smaller than the Tribune and the Sun-Times historically have been. It's probably larger than many of the other organizations up here are. But the cool thing about the era in which we live is that the race is on. Who's going to get to that right size first? Is it going to be the big companies shrinking or the small organizations growing? I'm upbeat and excited at that opportunity.
One thing I'd offer, and I do feel obligated to say this given what happened earlier, and if I was wealthy, I wouldn't be bargaining a union contract, I can assure you. What Sade expressed regarding the Tribune specifically, but I think it's true of a lot of legacy media, not looking like and fully representing the communities that they color is a very real problem, and I can attest that many people, not only people of color, sorry to use an expression that you hate, but even a lot of my white, straight colleagues, it's a constant source of frustration and scuttlebutt for us, including people who are in this room right now. And we acknowledge that it is a problem in the newsroom, the rank and file do, and discuss it on a regular basis. Sade was instrumental in helping us form the Guild, and she obviously felt that she could no longer work at the Tribune, and I feel badly that the Guild could not have done more quickly to keep her around. What I would offer is we're bargaining this contract, which came up at the top. On Thursday, we proposed language that requires the Tribune, or would require the Tribune, to interview, I believe it is 4 people from traditionally underrepresented groups for every internal and external job posting, as well as make a commitment in writing to, over a period of time, and what that period of time is subject to negotiations, ensure that their editorial staff represents the demography of the area that we cover. In this case, that'd probably be the Chicago DMA. It's not a panacea. I'm not going to pretend like it's going to fix everything. I'm not going to pretend like that's the only solution. But it is something that the editorial staff of the Tribune is cognizant of, talks about amongst itself, and is trying to address in our union negotiations.
Let me say this. About 70% of the new hires at the Chicago Tribune last year were people of color. About 60% of them were female. It's not enough. It's not enough. But we're making up for lost time.
Let's hear it for these wonderful people who gave up their Sunday afternoon. We'll call you back in the room in 30 minutes, and we'll do panel number 2 on the other side of your flyer. We did the first one of these 11 years ago, almost to the day, in this very room. And there are lots of rooms in Chicago, so why this room? And the answer to that is because this room has such an incredible Chicago political history. Some of us who are old enough will remember that this was one of the smoke-filled rooms. The Cook County Democrats did their slatings in here. A lot of us came in here for press conferences where you'd wait outside the door to find out who they anointed to run for judge or whatever it was. There is a reporter who needs to be remembered today. His name is Bob Davis. Robert Davis was a Tribune reporter in City Hall for many, many years. When this hotel switched hands and became Kimpton Hotel, the Allegro, in 1999, he wrote a piece in the Tribune called Loop Dreams, and I just want to read a couple sentences from it. You can get it. It's easy to, you can Google Loop Dreams, Robert Davis, 1999. A lunch hour at the Walnut Room in the Bismarck in the mid-1970s would have been a glimpse into the power structure of the times. Keene, everybody remember Alderman Keene? Keene would always be at the same table, which even had a private phone installed for his use. And again, for those of you who are a little younger, in the 1970s, if you had a table with a phone on it, you were somebody. Rich Daley would often come by to chat. on the way to the fifth floor hotel suite that served as Cook County's Democratic Party headquarters, because Daley was also the head of the Democratic Party headquarters. There was a hospitality table for Loop Alcoholics Anonymous members just off in one corner, and lesser political types would come in to sample the ambience and inhale the power in this room. So that was a little something there. And there was one other thing I wanted to mention that I know the hotel is kind of proud of. 1 minute after midnight at the end of Prohibition, the brothers who owned this hotel at the time, when it was the Bismarck, tapped open the first legal keg of beer in Chicago. Unlike other hotels, the Bismarck began serving beer a few minutes after midnight, according to a newspaper account. The first 20 barrels delivered in the Loop were unloaded in this room. So there you go. So what better place to have a journalism town hall, right? Thank you all for coming and for staying. We have a second panel here. Again, just one point of personal privilege, and I would say this to everyone because we feel that there is a pent-up energy in the room from what we've been talking to, the people we've been talking to. So we're going to really attempt to get people involved and we have a couple of mic wranglers. We have Rob Wildeboer from WBEZ and Sarah Sillins. They're going to be handling the mics. We asked them to do it because they did it 11 years ago when they were a lot younger. And we asked them to come back and do it again. The point of personal privilege is let's all try to be concise like the journalists we're supposed to be and try to keep it as short as we can because we want to try and cram as much in as we can. Heather Sharon, be brief.
Well, we're still at an inflection point in Chicago journalism. That hasn't changed since we met earlier this afternoon. Although it would be nice if we had managed to save journalism in such a short period of time, but alas. So I thought I would kick off this second panel by picking on my old friend Seamus Toomey, whom I worked for at DNA Info Chicago, the late lamented DNA Info. He and I were there when it started, and we were there when it ended. And so my question to him is, what have we learned in the 2 years or so since DNA Info went kaput?
Oof.
It was not easy to have me as an employee. I'll just put that out there.
Number one, don't rely on one funder. That's the obvious one. It was great while it lasted and while there was interest in it, but when the interest went away, it was really one person's decision to end DNA Info. And one of the reasons he ended it was that he basically put all the eggs into the banner ad basket. Let's try to get as many page views as we can, and let's get 0.0001 cent per banner ad, and that's just not going to work. Back of the envelope, it just doesn't work. So when we decided to bring it back as best we could, we did it as a nonprofit because we could tell that there were not going to be enough dollars out there necessarily to scale this into something that someone may want to buy and move all over the country, but we could probably do it just in Chicago with just a small newsroom. But we also learned that people really liked us. And when we went away, a lot of people wrote to us and said, hey, you never even asked us, to support you guys. Why didn't, if you'd asked us to buy a subscription, we would have done it. So we said, okay, well, let's test this out. Why don't we make it a subscription model? Some of it's free, some of it's behind the paywall. But let's go to the people that really trusted us, that really liked us, that were really sad when we went away, and say, hey, is this worth $59 a year to you? 47 if you take us up on our discount offer. But
always be selling.
But we did a Kickstarter to get us off the ground, and we set it pretty low. We're like, let's see if we can raise $25,000. And you guys, a lot of you folks in this room, we hit that $25,000 by like 11 a.m. on our first day, and it just went on and on and on and on. And that really put the wind in our sails that reader-supported newsroom, particularly one that is covering things that are important to people that aren't being covered by others, could be a viable newsroom. And, we're still trying to prove that out. We're 2 years in, but so
So
far,
this is
so good.
something like what Rob Feeder was talking about, right? It's important to talk about financial models, but you got to have an audience. You have to have something that an audience wants, and then they'll respond.
Well, I think that's the most important thing that, I don't know, we've hammered it home enough today, but listen, what people need are good stories. Stories that are important, that are impactful, that make a difference in their lives, that tell them something they don't know, even if it's what's being built at the corner of my street. Things that people want to pay for that I find valuable. And that's not editors doing that, that's reporters. I mean, that's where this money needs to go, is paying working journalists to be on the street, in the neighborhoods, talking to people that actually can tell them what's important to them. And then we can chase that. So, I'm self-serving because I'm a former reporter and I sort of picture myself as a reporter forever. But that's where I think the money should be going, is to reporters that are out there asking the hard questions or finding something silly to write about and, entertaining people briefly, for a couple minutes a day. People that are out there finding stories that are important, that are worth paying for.
As before, the same rules apply. Anyone can jump in anytime they want. If you don't, Heather and I will fill the vacuum with a question or two.
I could throw in something really quick just to piggyback off what Seamus said. I think it's valuable that
You
a lot of
should tell
people on
you're
this.
with the tribe.
Yes, I'm Tiffany Walden with the tribe. 2 eyes. Hey, Sade. And so for me, the thing that's most recognizable on this panel too is that a lot of us used to be reporters. It's taken away this idea that you have to be rich and mighty to own a newspaper or to own a media outlet. It's literally reporters who are in the newsroom who were tired of the way things were ran, or who may have been let go, or who may have taken a buyout, or people who just weren't valued in the newsroom, and their opinions and their pitches and things weren't valued. And so they came and they started their own organization. So Seamus saying that he's an editor now, and he is one of the top people at the organization now, but he came from the spirit of reporting. And that's important because then, the work that they're doing to raise money, you see that going back to the reporters. Same thing with the tribe. The work that we're doing is to try to build up the Black journalism community and to bring in people who may not have had the professional journalism training, who are often dismissed because they didn't go to a Medill or to a Columbia, to a Mizzou. They're written off, but they're doing that same work in the community. Zach TV was doing work in the community. He didn't have the journalism training, but he did what he knew how to do. So what would that have looked like if he was embraced by a news organization and brought in and given an opportunity to do reporting? Those communities, the Black community in Chicago, would have a bridge to the media. So I just want to point out that it's great to see, Bettina, who also came out of, a reporting background, also, running City Bureau. So that's key.
You just hit on something that I think is one of the things we were talking during the break we absolutely need to focus on here. And that's the fact that there are a lot of different pathways now into journalism. There is the traditional way through academics and through universities. But one of the most exciting things that's going on right now, in my personal opinion, is what Bettina's doing over at City Bureau. I was just talking to you, Bettina, during the break, and I'll repeat what I said. One of the pathways is, instead of having mom and dad pay $85,000 to put you through a university, they could subsidize you for a couple of years so you could work for free as a documenter and go through your fellowship programs, and you're going to come out of there with a real useful knowledge about how Chicago-specific journalism works.
Thank you, Ken. Also, one of our first fans, thank you for taking us on Chicago Newsroom all those years back. Well, first of all, I would say that we do pay documenters and we also pay our fellows because we think that the work of going out into the communities, listening to people, and then actually doing what they ask you to do should be paid work. So we feel really strongly about that. We think that it's really important. I think what I would say is that, yes, we need reporters who can go out there and do the everyday walk walk the block, do all of that. Having come from DNA Info, I see that, the value of that. I will say that I don't think, if you think that journalism is going to expand rapidly from where it is now, then yes, that would be awesome, and I would love to have reporters on every block. I think we all have to just sort of acknowledge the reality, which is that, journalism is shrinking, and so who is going to do that work, that extremely important work, when we're actively in a shrinking industry? And that's why City Bureau is all about democratizing access to the skills and the tools that journalists use. So I appreciate Tiffany bringing up my reporter background, which was not a great career for me. I'm very glad I'm an editor now. But I will say that the hours that I spent at the newsroom at DNA Info taught me that, we had published a story about a job fair happening at Midway, and I worked the weekend desk, so me sitting by myself in the newsroom, some Saturday somebody called and said, hey, I saw that story from DNA Info about that Midway job fair. What time is it and how do I get there? So first reaction as an editor who, I'm supposed to be editing 20 stories for the next day, I'm thinking, man, Google it, right? Just find that info. But then I'm like, wait a second, this is a person who's actively looking for a job. They took the initiative to call me to be like, okay, how do I get that info? And I'm like, well, I don't know why they missed the information in the story, but obviously that information did not get into their brain, and it was the most important info that they needed at that time. It was literally their livelihood, getting a job. And so why can't I take just a few minutes to Google it for them and tell them over the phone, right? And this is the problem that I think we're facing right now, is that a lot of the journalism that we do is sort of written for this high level, high tier of people who have a lot of power, and we think that they're going to help us make impact. But do we really want to live in a world in which the only people who can have impact are the people at the very top? It doesn't make sense to me. It's not a society that I want to live in. And I also don't think it's a good way to marshal our resources for journalism.
So that brings up, I think, an interesting point. So at DNA Info, there was no paywall. And I assume that had there been a paywall at DNA Info, that gentleman would not have been able to access that story, wouldn't have learned about the job fair, wouldn't have even had the opportunity to take the initiative. So the question is, are paywalls the way to go, and what do we lose when we wall off our content because we have no other choice, because we have to make money to pay those journalists and documenters, right? So that's...
This sounds like a Cranes question.
I knew it was coming at some point. Were you done asking the question?
I was.
Jim Kirk.
I don't think there's an either or answer to that. I think that it depends on your model. I think that there is obviously room and necessary, given the economics of the business and what it's done to traditional news gathering operations, for new funding resources to come in to support journalism like DNA, like ProPublica, like the BGA. But there's also, if you are reliant, if you are a for-profit operation, you most certainly need to put that content behind a paywall. And as was discussed in the earlier panel, we have done a very poor job as an industry over the past 50, 60, 100 years of understanding our reader and connecting with them. And I think you're seeing some changes happening, specifically, at the New York Times and what they've done as a model in mining and understanding their audience. They're averaging, 275,000 new subscribers per quarter. They have more subscribers than they ever had for the failing New York Times. So it is not an either-or situation. I think that some of the best journalism that we're seeing right now is coming from nonprofits, just because you have strong funders who want terrific journalists running these operations and hiring journalists to write for them. And then the other question, which I know was brought up in the other panel, so I'm sorry to kind of sound like a broken record here, but the partnerships with traditional media, I think, are going to be key. And we can argue about what that looks like, but I think frenemies, as we're calling it, is really part of the future for both nonprofit and for-profit. Nonprofits obviously need the content to get out there in a wider frame. Newsrooms and the for-profit side that have been depleted need that content, and I think there will be some very good middle ground for both sides to come together on that.
Want to, again, just invite anyone to jump in at any time. This is not a Q&A.
I'd like to. I think in the conversation that we've had so far today, there's an overemphasis on the business model from the finances, which of course certainly is important. But I think the business proposition needs to be the foundation of journalism and its role in democracy and in society, and really also as the only industry that's protected by the Constitution. Our country was founded in large part because of a free press. So I think and what we've kind of skirted around is about diversity and inclusion and the importance of reaching a larger audience that's increasingly multifaceted, be it by race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. The business model shouldn't just be about how to find financing to continue to produce content in the way that it's been done in the last 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years, but really looking at listening and engaging with an audience that under this current political climate is distrustful of media, is sampling and finding stories in large part by media like The Crusader and others that have been covering local communities, whether it be geographically or other marginalized groups, for a long period of time. So I think if we focus on diversity and inclusion, not as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to be realized, we will find, as we've seen disruptors in other genres like Netflix, in that pipeline, that people are willing to either pay a subscription or other if there's value added to what we're producing. So a little less emphasis on how to make perhaps pushing a square peg into a hole work, and a little more about engagement and taking the time to listen and learning, as Andres from McCormick had said, of what they're consuming and where they're consuming it.
So again, this seems to be an emerging theme from this gathering today. You got to have audience, right? I mean, if you're trying to pump up a publication or an entity that doesn't have any audience, the money is not necessarily going to bring you the audience. The audience will bring you funding. Is that right?
I would agree with that statement, Ken. And we're participants in Lens on Lightfoot. And when we talk about audience, part of it is by partnering with other organizations that have their own audiences, we are able to present our content to people who might not otherwise see it. So it serves us that way. But also, through those partners, we've begun holding events out in the community. We're not just sending our news out. Often, we and all kinds of other organizations in the city, I'm at the Better Government Association, we're going out in the community and talking about our work and inviting people to come and get engaged at a deeper level with the news. And it's a great way for us to interact with the people who are really reading the content or find new people. And it also addresses some of the other issues that have been talked about here today. When they see reporters and editors in the flesh and they hear about the kind of disciplined work that goes into producing news, people come away from that with a much deeper appreciation of the seriousness of the work and the impact that we can have. It also is this sweet spot as well where funders are looking for things like partnering. They're looking for things like how diverse are we in our newsrooms and how diverse are our audiences. And so those efforts all combine toward, I think, a kind of virtuous kind of ecosystem of effort. And so those are
those are the kind of the parts in the mix right now that are changing the way journalism is done in Chicago.
And let's not forget inclusivity, because diversity without inclusion is a paper, it's a paper dragon. So I think a lot of what I saw in the first panel discussion was a lack of inclusivity and a feeling of exploitation of legacy media, which we can say fairly, I think we could say, has a homogeneous leadership that is trying to reinvent something that has existed all along. And instead of trying to put lipstick on a pig and say, well, this is innovation, it's very important for media, beginning with legacy media, to build bridges with media, entrepreneurial media, media that is reaching both geographically and marginalized groups in a very organic, authentic way. So inclusivity needs to be part of the formula, the strategic formula to be successful. Without inclusivity, then what you have is perhaps a newsroom or content that looks diverse, but when you unpack it, you realize it's just touching the surface and not reaching and speaking authentically to the audience that we're trying to reach.
Hugo, we should just welcome you to Chicago, by the way. Hugo just started at Channel 11 a little while ago as news director there, and we welcome you.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Can I say something?
I wanted to piggyback on what he's saying. First of all, welcome to Chicago. It's nice to have the president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists here in Chicago. I want to also give a shout out to the president of the National Association of Black Journalists, Dorothy Tucker, who is in the audience.
Chicago is getting it done.
So what I wanted to piggyback on is that I think Hugo is absolutely correct that, you know, it really comes down to diversity and inclusion when we're talking about reaching audiences today. And, you know, I really like what many of the nonprofits are doing and the fact that they are able to get young journalists who haven't gone the traditional route out into the communities and to gain the experience. But what can't be missed is the efforts of legacy media like mine, where at the Chicago Sun-Times, you know, my boss, Christopher Fusco, he always talks about there are things we do for trust, and there are things we do for, you know, to build audience, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things we do for trust is the Chicago Chronicles, and which is my column. And, you know, I want to say that this was a brainchild. I want to say this was a brainchild of both my former boss, Jim Kirk, who sits up here, and my current boss, Chris Fusco. But it was a recognition that as we, you know, as legacy media continues to bleed advertisers and to confront this whole trust issue by communities who do not see themselves in legacy media or any media and have developed a distrust of the media. And as we confront those charges of fake news, et cetera, we have to do more to build trust with our audience and to build trust with those audiences who have dismissed us as being disrespecting of them or dismissive of them. And so columns like mine, where I focus in on those stories in the Black community, where I find the positive stories, you know, individuals and organizations who are doing things that are not reported on, that you're not going to find every day within our pages, and profiling those. You know, that's the way you build trust. And those may not be the clickbait, you know, stories, you know, but those are the stories that where the audience begins to feel that, okay, we're not only seeing ourselves within your paper when it is a mugshot, right? We're seeing ourselves in various hues and intonations. So I just want to say that you can't write that off. It's happening everywhere. It's happening in legacy media. We recognize that we have to do this, and we are doing it. And lastly, I'll just mention, you know, it's not just me. We are also, legacy media like ours are reaching out through organizations like Report for America. You know, we have two amazing reporters, Latino journalists within our newsrooms who did not go the traditional route to journalism, but they are doing amazing work of covering the Latino community in Chicago. And these are the type of efforts that build trust. And, you know, once you build that trust, it's that old adage, you build it and they will come.
I want to invite. Jackie from the Southside Weekly, who's the new editor-in-chief over there, to talk about how she sees the Southside Weekly's role in this very discussion, because I don't know her, but I do know her via Twitter, which I think I know all of you via Twitter. And I know she's got some feelings on this.
And I still have to interrupt here because I heard you on Fred Klonsky, on the Klonsky Brothers show, telling this wonderful story about how you got started, that you felt that legacy media wasn't treating you and your community well, and you started a Facebook post, and it ended up being so huge that it was bigger than what most legacy media have. And I think it's an astounding story. And take a minute or two just to tell us, introduce who you are, because it's wonderful that you're in this new job.
Thanks, everyone. So I just want to talk a little bit about how I got my foot in the journalism field. It was very non-traditional. This was around the time when a lot of our communities were joining Facebook, and I saw Facebook as a tool that could potentially inform our communities and create conversations that needed to be had, but we just did not have the spaces, and the media was not truly reflecting our concerns and the conversations that we were having within our community. I come from the Little Village neighborhood, which is where you can find the concentration of Mexican and Mexican Americans in Chicago. Even though we're all over the city, when you go to Little Village, there's about 80,000 or so Mexicans there. And I felt that 10 years ago, legacy media would reduce our narrative down to us being illegal aliens or gangbangers, or they would portray us in a very folkloric-like, stereotypical way. I knew that there was a lot more to our community, a lot more positive stories that were simply not being highlighted because they were not in the radar of mainstream journalists and mainstream media in general. So I used Facebook. Like I said, I saw Facebook as a tool. I saw social media as a tool, as a means to an end. And I launched a Facebook page for the Little Village community that grew to be right now 140,000 followers and counting. So that to me shows...
Did you say 140,000? I thought that's what you said.
Yeah, 140,000. So we've had this page for 10 years. It's incredible. But I think it shows that there's a market there. There's actually many markets within Chicago that are not being tapped into. And in my opinion, could be developed, could be monetized if there was a desire to. So now that I'm at the Southside Weekly as editor-in-chief, it is definitely one of my goals to develop homegrown journalists, people who are born and raised in our neighborhoods and who are often not given the opportunity to enter the field of journalism and to tell their own stories.
Ken, so I want to follow on what Jackie was saying. Listening to the first panel, I found myself wondering whether our anxieties, understandable anxieties about the economic condition of journalism, aren't stunting our imaginations in how we think about how to go forward, how to tell stories, how to find stories. And so I think it's important to entertain the possibility that there's a critical discourse about the future of journalism that doesn't start and end with money. That, as I think Hugo said at the end, in invoking First Amendment values, there are all sorts of other value frames for thinking about our work, our mission, and it may well be, as in Jackie's case, and I have a sort of parallel career, that starting with the assumption that there are huge assets, there are stories that are being left on the table, stories that aren't being told by major media that are critically important stories, immense asset, that there are audiences that are not being served and have long not been served, an immense asset. So, thinking more strategically that way, and we've mentioned business models and we've mentioned audience, but we haven't talked enough about story, about necessary stories that people are hungry for, people respond to when they're presented. Stories that, if they're of quality, I mean, hateful word can be monetized. People want to read them. They want to, reproduce them in various ways. And so, just briefly, the history that kind of tracks what Jackie was describing in my case was becoming frustrated with the coverage of the South Side of Chicago many years ago, with a colleague who happens to be here, David Eads, who went on from our little venture to the Tribune, NPR, ProPublica, now the Chicago Reporter. In public housing on South State Street, we started a small, emailed publication, The View from the Ground, the premise of which was that there were things that could only be learned on the ground, only be learned from the people most affected by policies and practices in the city. And we operated out of one public housing development, Stateway Gardens, 8 square blocks of the South Side. I mean, I leave it to others to judge, but I venture to say that stories have come out of that 8 square blocks that have had significant impact on the city and that have had national import. And much of the reporting that I'm known for, more recently, actually came out of that practice. It came out of that deep, immersive, I mean, again, it's a kind of a patronizing word, hyperlocal, but that kind of reporting. And so, I just want to maybe tilt the frame a little bit and have us recognize the possibilities that are at hand, possibilities that are exemplified by a number of the sort of startup publications that are represented here today. There are all sorts of strategic questions, in terms of how to build larger platforms, how to hold up different voices, how to build a more viable financial basis. But there's also an immense creative space that's opened up, and it's opened up in part by virtue of some large shade trees having lost some of their branches.
So I feel
Actually, could I just want to add to that. I think it's such an important point. We're here at a journalism town hall and have spent very little time actually talking about journalism. And I think all these questions around audience and business models are really at their heart a question about how do we convince people that what we do has value, that it is fundamental to democracy. That's at the root of all of it.
And fundamental to their individual lives,
Yes.
to what it means to be human, what it means to be connected to others, to a world of ideas, the sense of possibility. That's also the work that we do as journalists. And I have to say, just to build on this idea of reimagination, despite the fact that I think we all recognize the serious existential threats to the profession, economically, technologically, rhetorically, the moment we live in now in Chicago is also filled with so much excitement and promise, represented by everybody who's been on these panels and in this room. This is a tremendously rich, dynamic, exciting moment in journalism where I feel that the creative energies are broadening story frame, broadening who gets to tell those stories, broadening the pathways into newsrooms, reshaping what it means to be a journalist in this region at this time. And I think there's so much to build upon right now. I just want to applaud the individuals on this panel who have, through a lot of different iterative, innovative, trial and error ways, been able to find really viability through, at the end of the day, to build on your point, Louise, service. Service built around quality and trust. And I think that if we keep those as our North Star, not dismissing the real business concerns and the real technological challenges, that will be the thing that ultimately guides us to a much better place than just simply trying to restore old models that have been lost.
Karen, I want to come to you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I just found myself falling back on this thing that I used to do when I was a reporter in a scrum, and I could never ever get a question. Like, ever. If you are a young
Try
woman...
try doing that with Fran Spielman sitting next to you.
Right?
You'll learn
I mean,
real quick.
This is what I would do when I would go to a press conference for Governor Quinn, is that I would catch the eye of the young woman handler and just be like, please, throw me a bone here. So, thank you. I feel like it goes back to this notion of who can be a reporter and what it takes to be a reporter. If you are not loud, you can't be a reporter. If you are not aggressive, you can't be a reporter.
If you're not a man, you can't be a reporter.
If you're not a white man, you can't be a reporter. And I think all of this talk about non-traditional routes to journalism ignores that, and ignores that you can get there. You can arrive, you can go to the right school, you can do all of the things, and you will still be ignored. By the way, when I was doing that thing where I was catching the eye of the person to get my question asked, I worked for the Associated Press. Okay? So it didn't matter where I was from. It didn't matter how much student loan debt I had from Medill. What mattered was that I was invisible.
I mean, what we're really talking about is diversity of narratives, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, we're sitting at a time here discussing the future of journalism at a time when we're really confronting the browning of America. I mean, you know, we can continue covering the same stories and telling the same narrative from the same perspective that becomes relevant to no one, or relevant to a smaller and smaller diminishing population. If we are not reflecting America back to America, if we are not reflecting Chicago back to Chicago, if Chicago's Black and Latino communities do not see themselves within the pages of my newspaper or her newspaper or any of these digital startups, if Chicago's Black and Latino community do not see me in their community covering their news, do not see African American and Latino journalists in the communities covering their news, we are speaking to a smaller and smaller diminishing population. And we can continue to do that, and they will not come. They will not come because we are doing nothing to attract them. And so we are talking in essence here about diversity of narrative. Whether it's me at the Legacy newspaper, or whether it's Bettina at City Bureau, or whether it's Cranes, or whether it's Louise, you know, it's got to be diversity of narrative. And we're all talking about doing the same thing. And we can talk economy all we want, but unless we're building something that reflects back to the new America, the new Chicago, the new reality, they will not come.
Karen, I'm going to come back to you.
One thing.
Just one last. I also want
one thing.
Go ahead, Karen.
So I just also want to say, I think a point that I meant to make earlier is that it is not enough to have the newsroom look like Chicago if you do not treat those people well. And I get so frustrated about these conversations about diversity, and for some reason, journalists equate diversity with young people. And I said this on a panel at NLGJA, that people of color, Black people, other people of other communities didn't just get invented. It's not like young people just one day woke up and were like, oh, we want to be journalists now. There are so many journalists my age, and I'm older than I look, and older, who are no longer in the industry because they were so mistreated and so disrespected. And we ignore that. We get these people in these newsrooms and you treat them terribly.
One of the things I want to make sure.
Let's get to just one second. Excuse me, just one second. Let's get people ready. Rob, are you around? Rob Wildemore? Yeah, okay. And,
where are our microphone wranglers?
There they are, right there.
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
One of the things I want to make sure that the audience
people.
understands that this isn't just about the African American community or the Latino community and just about more reflection and inclusivity of the changing demographics of our country. This is something that everybody needs to care about. Tomorrow, the government has gotten the green light to push forward with the public charge. Just 2 weeks ago, the Trump administration talked about sending elite agents and purposeful around undocumented immigrants. We are weeks away from the beginning of the census. This is something that is not a Latino story or a particular issue. It's all of our issues, and it's very important that while the epicenter of the narratives that we're talking about is about inclusivity, whether it's by race, gender, sexual orientation, age, and also of thought and interest, it's important for everybody to understand, do not segregate. Inclusion is key. A lot of the projects that I've either been a part of or observed, the genesis starts from a perspective of the other, and the initiatives are launched by people that are not part of the audience and the community that they're trying to reach. When you segregate and you create these narratives that are cliquish or cliches, then you don't really leverage the opportunity in reaching a larger audience, because everybody should care about those stories and not just the individuals that it pertains or it's focused on.
How about this? Could we throw something else out? A slightly different thing. It's a kind of a diversity issue. What about the fact that I don't think anybody under 25 years old even knows how to operate a radio. They've never seen one. They don't know what it is.
We shouldn't stereotype them like that, though. My nephew knows how to
does he?
work a radio.
Okay, right.
He's 18 years old.
But most people are not consuming media the way most of us in this room have in the past. So this is also true, obviously, for printed papers, publications of various kinds. They live in a world that is completely and utterly different from ours, regardless of race. And everyone on this panel has to deal with that at some point in some way. You're trying to reach people who will, in 20 years, be the power in this country, and they have no association with your product. Their association is with, TikTok or whatever it is, Facebook, probably not Facebook, but certainly Twitter, and they are not in your cohort.
I just want to bring this up because I think me and Tiffany are the youngest people on this panel. And I think a lot of the things that we've been talking about today go back to something that I think is actually the most lo-fi thing out there. So we've been talking about audience, and we've been talking about the need to keep people informed. City Bureau believes that you can inform people without telling a story at all. I think that we can all agree just logically that that makes a lot of sense, and yet in our industry, for some reason, we tend to be like, if that's not a story, then we can't dedicate any time or money to it. I think that that is a huge missed opportunity for journalists who are extremely smart and very good at collecting information and good at distributing it in one single way, which is telling a story. We are so limiting ourselves, not only by that, I think also thinking of communities of color, yes, they're a wonderful asset in terms of a potential audience, but they're also producers. They're constantly producing content. We are constantly producing content for each other. And when we say that people need to be informed, by whom and for what end? Is it to pay my salary? No. People need to be informed because of democracy, because an informed citizen is somebody who is able to participate in our society together. But why do they need to be informed by journalists? And how come we're not putting more effort into showing people? So the means of production of journalism have not been diversified or distributed at all, but the means of actually distributing stuff, everybody has it now, right? So you don't need a radio in order to get your podcast out there. You don't need a newspaper for somebody to read your op-ed. And so how come we're still, we hear, exactly, on TV too. Like this is on YouTube Live. You know how many other people are live on YouTube right now besides us, right? And so like even look at this room, like we are this group of people sitting up here on this dais. Like we have so much more to say than like anyone walking out there today. And like what does that say about our industry, that we have this kind of top-down look on the way that information is distributed?
Yeah, and
Jackie?
we have to stop, we have to meet people where they are. And I think I've been talking with a lot of people who look at millennials. I'm in the millennial group. Look at millennials as these people who are lazy. Look at millennials as people that don't read the news. These people that are disinterested in the news. And the tribe has literally been debunking that this whole time we've been out here and writing these stories. millennials and people younger than millennials are very, very, very much invested in news and what's going on in their neighborhoods. We have to meet people where they are, and we have to repair these relationships with the communities as well, instead of coming in now and saying, oh, well, we're here, so tell us everything you know about your neighborhood, or talk to us, or do this or do that. People are not willing to be that open with a media who has literally dismissed them and written terrible stories about them, to be quite frank, for years. The black community has been written about terribly in Chicago, dating back to the 1800s. So how can you expect to walk into a black community as a reporter and say, hey, like, I'm here, talk to me? No one's going to talk to you. You go to the West Side, no one's going to talk to you if they don't know who you are. And the same thing works with these, I'm calling them kids, but the same thing works with millennials and people who are younger than me. They're not going to talk to you unless they see that you're putting in an actual effort to be involved in their communities and to know about their news and what bothers them and what ticks. Last year when we were doing Should I Vote, one of the biggest things that people worried about was whether millennials were going to go out and vote. And millennials were catalysts in all of the movements that have happened here in Chicago, including the change in administration across the board from Chicago through Cook County. No one looks at millennials in that way as being the leaders of that movement and the work that they put into that movement. Instead, it was this thing of, well, millennials not going to show up and vote, like, whatever. They're not going to do this, they're not going to do that. And they did show up and vote. So we have to get out of this mentality of, how do we get people to come to us? We have to go to them. I can't express that enough. And a lot of independent and startup media here in Chicago is doing that. But if we continue to just throw news out there and expect people to all of a sudden be invested because we now have 2 or 3 black reporters here, that's not going to happen. Like, they have to see that investment in the community.
Something I wanted to add is that a big reason why young people are sometimes dismissive of broadcast media or print media is not because they have something against these mediums. These are just mediums, like I said earlier. These are just tools. It's because the narrative has remained the same. The hiring has remained inequitable. The narrative has remained inequitable. And so young people do not want to engage with that. They will find more diversity of opinion and more diversity in narrative and coverage on the internet or on their phones than they will, just turning on the television or going to a legacy newspaper. And just as an example, we have the Southside Weekly, which is a newspaper. It's a free newspaper, and it's almost entirely run by young people who are under 30 years old. I'm a millennial myself, and we're all extremely invested in putting out, a print newspaper, and it actually does pretty well. We put out 10,000 copies.
Big footprint on it. I mean, you're distributed really widely now, right?
Yeah, we distribute in over 200 locations throughout the South Side. Like I said, it's entirely youth-led, and right now we're going through different efforts to diversify our team and to make it more representative of the South Side. So back to my point, we should just look at these different media tools as just that, as tools and as mediums. But we really need to focus on what is the message that we're delivering, who are the sources that we're quoting, who are the reporters that we're hiring or bringing on board. It needs to be truly representative of the readership that we're aiming to serve.
And I want to add to that too, give young people a chance. Like, True Star is here in the room somewhere. True Star Media has been out here for years. When I was in high school, True Star came to Providence St. Mel and was recruiting kids to come write for their magazine, and they were doing cool and edgy things for black youth in Chicago. Free Spirit Media does a lot of work with youth, and there's a lot of youth here who are trying to get into the journalism game, and they need an opportunity. And in journalism, a lot of times it's this thing of, we need you to have 3 to 5 years of experience before you can come work here, or we need you to have gone to this school or done this or done that in order to work here. But again, there are youth out here and there are young budding journalists out here who want to be in the field and want to thrive in the field, not even just be in it, but be sustainable. But we have to give them an opportunity as well. And if we don't do that, then you're going to see this disinterest with younger generations and not wanting to be in journalism, because no one is accepting and opening to being mentors and grooming them and teaching them about the industry.
I want to ask Louise to weigh in on something that Jackie said. Jackie was talking about the need to show our work, that stories don't just appear out of the blue ether fully formed. And I know ProPublica does a lot about explaining how stories were reported. And you've been here in Chicago for about a couple years now. Do you think that has helped you gain credibility in sort of the wild and woolly Chicago media market?
Well, ProPublica Illinois has been here for about 2 years. I've lived here in Chicago for 28, and most of our staff are longtime or native Chicagoans as well. And ProPublica itself is 11 years old. It was started in New York in 2008. I think that you're getting back to what I think is a central question, and that is, how do all of us, through our work, rebuild the trust that we have lost and fight back, as Rob mentioned in the earlier panel, fight back against the diminishment and demeaning of journalism. And I think that transparency is key to that. And that is a cornerstone of trust. And so one thing we really try to do at ProPublica is share the work. And that may mean for us, we typically put out all the data that is behind our reporting, almost all of it for free, so people can use it themselves for whatever reasons they may have. One of our reporters, Melissa Sanchez, was here, and I think is still here. There she is, who has done an amazing package of work on the city's unfair ticketing practices, work in collaboration with WBEZ that has resulted in 55,000 people getting their licenses back.
That was an excellent project.
Debt relief, $11 million so far in debt relief for people who really were driven into bankruptcy through unpaid tickets. We put all the data behind that reporting online so people could use it, and many people have. I think we've had at least 1,200 people download that data so far, ranging from academics to people who just kind of want to see what's happening in their own ward on ticketing issues. So we do that. We share information about our work in reports 3-4 times a year. And we try to be really open and write about the process of our journalism. But I think, as part of that, I've come to realize that even all that is not enough. I had an encounter probably 2 years ago now when I first started in this job with someone who thought that an anonymous source was anonymous to us, that we did not know.
Everybody thinks that.
I have had that experience
Everybody
as well.
thinks that except for people sitting in this room.
Right?
I just want to put that out there.
And Bettina, you're exactly right. People laugh. People in this room laugh when I say that, but it's not funny. It's not that person's ignorance that's the problem. It is our arrogance that we believe that everyone should know how we do our jobs. And they don't. And I think it's incumbent upon us to talk about it so people can see that we do care, that we are fair, that we are doing our best, and that we are of worth to them.
You mentioned that you had collaborated with WBEZ, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, WBEZ is now the third largest newsroom in Chicago behind the Sun-Times and the Tribune. So I'll ask Steve Edwards to talk a little bit about how that's been possible, and whether it's only because there are people like me who listen to podcasts while doing chores, and that I am the answer to public radio's budgetary problems.
And they do it without full-page ads from Menards, too.
Well, there are a couple of themes implicit in your question. I mean, let me first just say to many people on this panel, we've had the benefit of collaborating editorially in really substantial ways that has helped us just expand our service, deepen our service. And, I'm grateful for the collaborations. I'm grateful for the members of our team, the reporters, editors, our managing editor, Tracy Brown, is sitting here in front of me, and so many others who have dedicated themselves to doing high quality, rigorous, in-depth reporting and context, which I think is a theme that all of us here today are talking about and underscoring. We're also grateful that we have, by virtue of our nonprofit status and by virtue of that thing called the Public Radio Pledge Drive, where we annoy all of you who listen several times a year to donate, we have actually a model and a culture that is about asking people if they value the work that we do, back to the point I think, Louise, you were making earlier, that we ask you to put a little into the tip jar, as it were, to become a member. And so by virtue of that, that has allowed us a degree of stability in what has been a very, very tumultuous, unsettled time for so many of our colleagues in other news organizations that historically have been rooted in one or overwhelmingly in one direction, particularly as it relates to legacy corporate advertising and sponsorship. I say all that with a degree of gratitude, but also a degree of humility. Those same forces that many other legacy news organizations are facing, we're facing too. The excitement of digital technologies in terms of the possibilities for opening up access for storytelling and new narratives and information flow and the way in which we might actually convey our work is exciting. It also fragments audiences. It also creates new forms of competition and dispersal of experiences that makes it hard to tie back to one organization, one newsroom, one program, what have you. So, you were asking earlier about podcasts and, and radio. How many people here, by the way, wake up to a clock radio? Just by a show of hands. A clock radio. Okay. If I had asked that question probably even 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, the whole room would have raised its hands. And this isn't even the youngest group you could assemble here. And if I did this on a college campus today or in high school auditorium or another
they'd be like,
"What's
what's a clock radio?"
They would be, what in the hell are you talking about?
What's a clock?
So I say that just to illustrate the point that you were alluding to, I think, both Heather and Ken, that the things that have propelled us traditionally around our core broadcast experience are also morphing and changing as they are for our colleagues in print and television as well. I am bullish on listening. We are really at what I think is a third kind of pivot point in the digital revolution. If you go back to the advent of the web browser in the mid-90s, and you come 10 years after that to the mid-2000s with smartphones and social media, we're now with voice-activated, artificial intelligence-based technologies, and I would fold podcasting, even though it's a different manifestation under that, on the cusp of a third wave in that ongoing digital revolution. So I'm bullish on listening, hugely bullish on listening. And we know that people throughout the age spectrum are listening more than they ever have before. It's highly portable, highly personal. It's the only medium you can actually multitask with. And it has tremendous possibility for connection and storytelling. The challenge we face in an on-demand environment is there are, I think, last count was close to 800,000 podcasts that exist. And getting discovered in that space is really, really complicated, let alone making a kind of connection that I think all of us hope our organizations are able to make. It comes back to us, the same things that have guided our work in the traditional broadcast realm, and that is trying to do the very, very the best, highest quality work we possibly can, delivering service and trust, and hope that that builds loyalty. But it is certainly a challenge that we're facing every day.
Are there questions? If there are, Sarah, where are you? Sarah's over there, and Rob Wildeboord's over there. Just go over there, and we'll start folding questions in. Okay? All right. Should we want to do it right now? Let's do one.
Okay. Hi, Justin Kerr, McKinley Park News. I wanted to ask if you folks could speak to the phenomenon of the travails of our industry as kind of like a business failure of the news industry. I can't disagree more profoundly with the statement that the young lady over there started off this event with, stating that this never could have been anticipated. Who could have seen these things coming? Well, clearly a lot of people did. And it seems like there's a lot of bad business decisions that have been made over and over again from the top down in the news industry. As an example, maybe you folks could raise your hand if you think that Google or Facebook, as we've heard about a lot, are kind of a threat to your revenue model or the practice of journalism. Do you folks, anybody feel that?
From a business model, that ship has already sailed.
Well, from a business model, that ship has already sailed. Okay, but then I want to ask you, if you consider these to be your competitors, how many of you are using Google Analytics to measure your web traffic? How many of your operations rely on G Suite? Or how many dollars are you paying into Facebook to promote that thing? Jackie, are you making any money off of your thousands and thousands of users for Facebook, or are you just helping Facebook, with their bottom line?
I'm helping the community, and that's kind of like how I see it. I've had the opportunity to monetize those thousands and tens of thousands of followers, and I have chosen not to. I could be buying up ads, possibly collaborating with local businesses, but it's something that I have chosen not to do.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking forward. It seems like the leadership of the news industry from the business level has been failing for decades, and should we continue to listen to these folks? What's the path forward? Maybe the success and innovation is with these smaller operations coming up, or maybe the not-for-profit model. So I just wanted to. Thanks.
Let's go
Rob,
over
you got
here.
one? You got one over there?
Awesome, thank you. Hi, my name is Asia Beckham. I did the City Bureau Fellowship. It was a wonderful opportunity to learn about journalism for the first time. Currently, economic justice editor at FSM, continue to develop some skills. My question for the panel here, and the first panel as well, for folks who aren't going to a traditional journalism school like Medill, what opportunities are you opening? How are you opening up your doors to folks who are going to non-traditional journalism schools like myself and now looking to get into the industry? And if there are any opportunities at your organization, I'd love to hear about them.
I can tackle that one. We have a pretty open way into our newsroom. We really ask folks to tell us what you want to write about. Like, we had a lot of people that come and say, hey, can I freelance for you? And our first question is, sure, give us 5 stories that you want to write right now that are important to you. So to me, again, back to my idea that it's always about the stories that drive. It's going to drive traffic, it's going to drive interest, it's going to drive loyalty. So I would say to the young reporters in here or out there watching it, if you've got important stories that are going untold in your neighborhood or in your city that you want to write about, come to us, and pitch them to us. And we have editors that can, help work through them or tell you like, oh yeah, this is great. This is the way to do it. Go for it. That's how we're trying to get younger journalists into the room that, honestly, I don't come to them and say, send me your resume first and let me check your bona fides. We're like, we can do that. We can do other ways of seeing what you've written in the past before. But we really were interested in the story. Talk us out. How are you going to execute this? What's it going to be? When can you do it? What's it going to be about? But that's how we do it. So we just tell people, pitch us stories, and we'll get back to you and let you know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So in the case of the Southside Weekly, we're a volunteer newspaper, almost 100%. Myself and a couple of other editors do get a stipend. But I wanted to say that kind of opens the newsroom to the community. It does make it in a way more democratic because we get people who want to submit a story and they come with different levels of experience, different levels of writing experience, and many of them do not have a journalism background or never went to journalism school. So we're willing to work with people of all skill levels, and it truly is a type of mentorship because the editing process is a very robust process where it's an ongoing conversation between several editors and the writer who's proposing a story, and we will meet them where they're at and provide the guidance and the tools that they need to bring that story to fruition. So we do pride ourselves in having an open and democratic newsroom.
And I would just add to that.
Go ahead.
Okay. The question I've always asked myself, and my colleagues at the Invisible Institute are now infected with it, is what won't get done if we don't do it? so much journalism is sort of competition for attention with essentially redundant stories. And so I think that's just a useful kind of discipline to ask, what won't get written, what won't get reported if you don't do it?
I just wanted to say, in terms of legacy media, there still is a requirement for the traditional pathway of journalism school for legacy media. But what I wanted to say is that these days, a larger percentage of our membership at the National Association of Black Journalists, and perhaps other organizations of color, are more and more being made up of people who are not going the traditional route and are coming in. And so I wanted to encourage you to please visit us at nabjchicago.org. And we have lots of mentoring, people at Legacy Media who are willing to mentor you and bring you in and take you along the path. So please do.
I want to jump off of a part of that question and put Jamie on the spot.
I know.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Really quickly, chicagoreader.com. If you go all the way to the bottom and click on careers, we have a social justice reporting fellowship we are hiring for. It is a year long. We have the salary listed. We offer full benefits. That's right.
This is beginning to sound like a presidential debate.
And our pitch guidelines are also on the Reader website. I think when you tell people to pitch to you, even journalism students don't know what that means. They don't know what's in a pitch.
It is not taught in journalism school.
No, very rarely, right? Only now. And so I feel like the Reader's pitch guidelines are incredibly prescriptive, and I apologize for that, but it does tell you what should go into a pitch in general.
I have one more question for you guys, just quickly. So the first panel and the second panel here, I'm wondering, I think Bettina touched on it a little bit, that it's coming from the top down. But FSM, they really do. It's youth-led. Yola Kali is youth-led. How are journalism agencies making sure that learning is intergenerational and the newsrooms are collaborating intergenerationally?
I can answer that too. So the tribe is at Free Spirit Media. We have a partnership with Free Spirit Media where we go into the newsroom and we work with the participants there and help them see some of their stories from start to finish. They pitch stories to us. We go over pitch ideas at different meetings, and their stories end up on thetribe.com. So that's one of the ways that I encourage media outlets to get involved with budding journalism programs, and even folks younger than that, really get out there and be able to mentor folks and help them see their stories through from start to finish, and the reporting aspect of it as well, because there's even things that during reporting that you kind of learn just as you're going along. You learn that if you're in a newsroom, or you learn that from mistakes even. And those are some things that could be avoided, I think, too, if we're in a newsroom, guiding and helping younger aspiring journalists, make it to that next level. So that's one of the things that we're committed to, is being involved with young people and folks who are just out of college and trying to get a job. Because I know when I graduated from Medill, in my mind, I was going to New York. I was going to have a magazine job and do all of these things. And none of those internships paid. It was impossible for me to go into journalism after graduation. And my mom, they were just like, why did you even major in this thing? They were so upset with me for that. And so by the grace of God, I got an internship at Ebony Magazine, and Adrian Samuels Gibbs took me under her wings and led me down a newspaper path. I went through newspaper and had to leave Chicago and then find my way back here through freelancing and then starting the tribe. But we shouldn't have to do that. We shouldn't have to leave and go somewhere. I wasn't making any money in my job in Texas. So we should find ways to, get people more involved after graduation and before graduation, so that's not this, this struggle period of surviving when you get out of school and majoring in journalism, because no one wants to major in it now. You don't make any money, and you got to eat.
I just want to add something, because I think the question you asked gets into something that's really critical for the profession as a whole and for organizations in particular. And it's something we're spending more and more time being very intentional about. To go back to your original question around internships, we have more than a dozen interns who are with us. They're embedded with teams, and they spend 6 months. So I think and they're paid. So those are really important things. The length of time, the fact that you're embedded in a team and that you have the opportunity to work shoulder to shoulder with colleagues is really, really critical to the learning experience. What we're spending more time now thinking about is everything thereafter. And under Tracy's leadership, we have just begun a much more extensive series of trainings just on an ongoing basis where we want to build a culture of continuous learning. And that's true for young journalists and veteran journalists. To have a series of formal and informal sessions where we actually are skill building and we're talking about the work we do and interrogating it. The third place where we want to go is actually more squarely to your point, and that is developing an internal mentorship program whereby people who have well-developed skills in certain areas, somebody's a great writer, somebody's terrific in audio editing and mixing, and somebody else who's great at writing digital headlines or doing photography, that those can pair up and that we actually have an opportunity peer-to-peer to deepen skill base and to grow skill base as we go over time. Professional development in most traditional news organizations is woefully lacking. It's through informal networks, tying your boat to somebody, an editor who took a little bit more time than somebody else to give you a tip, trial and error, learn by doing. And I think it's a profession we have to be much, much more intentional about not only the pipeline and how we're actually broadening the pipeline for people coming into the profession, but also when folks are with us to really grow and nurture the skills throughout their entire careers.
I'd like to point out that we're in overtime here. We'll do about another 10 minutes or so, and maybe take a couple questions here. But an idea was brought up, and it may be almost too late to do this now, but at the end of the program, what we'd like to do is have our photographers come up here on stage and shoot a picture of Journalism Chicago at this moment in time in this room. So if you'd like to stick around, just to be photographed, we're going to try to take a group shot of everybody who's here. So just keep that in mind. Don't run out the door if you want to be a part of the picture. And I want to just throw in one more issue if we can. What I depend on journalism for myself is I want a journalism organization to teach me something that I didn't know, to tell me something that I was not aware of when I woke up this morning. If it's corruption in county government, whatever it is, or many other kinds of things that just bring my attention to something that I had no idea was going on. We generally refer to that as investigative. Under the new rules, maybe it's something else. But I feel that that is the thing that's most threatened in all of these new models that we're talking about. Now, maybe I'm just wrong, and I admit that I'm old, so it may be an old man's perspective, but I see those very important roles of journalism being deeply threatened.
So,
Discuss.
Ken, as I think in some sense you're right. If you look at, say, the teams of people that the legacy media used to have in their newsrooms, and they were tasked with doing investigative work. They're dedicated almost exclusively to investigative reporting. One of the really great things about what's going on now with this kind of breakdown of the old kind of silos of journalism is that you are not limited any longer to the people in your newsroom when it comes to doing a story. And we all have opportunities now to kind of pick the best people to go after a certain story. We had a great collaboration with WBEZ that started before the feds publicly went after Ed Burke, where we were able to pair a reporter in our newsroom who had great background on the Ed Burke story with a reporter at WBEZ who also had a great background on Ed Burke, and go after that story as two separate newsrooms devoting resources to a story. And the startup media in town are more and more developing the capacity, given the expertise that they have in either content areas or geographic areas. They're developing the abilities on their own to do more enterprising and investigative type work. And we as a legacy investigative shop are actively looking for opportunities to work with those organizations, and in fact have a couple of investigations underway. To me, the real competitive attribute, the growth attribute that all of our news organizations now need is that partnering mentality. And that's what's going to distinguish the real kind of successful news organizations from those that are less successful. I would differ with what you just said in the sense that I feel that the pool of potential investigative reporters in the city is probably larger with more access to more assets, both in terms of the reporting assets as well as the audiences, than it perhaps ever has been.
If I said that, I differ with myself too.
I'm sorry. I just want to jump in because I actually disagree. I think that the type of journalism that most is under attack right now, and maybe we're not even realizing it because it has really not been able to gain much ground in recent years, is community and ethnic media. That is a place that is not sexy, that like rich people don't want to write checks for. You know, as I forgot who said it, maybe my colleague Harry will tell me, there is no wire cutter for the poor. If you want to buy the fanciest, best Alexa activated speaker, you can Google it. The New York Times has spent like maybe $40,000 trying to figure that out for you. If you want to try to avoid getting ripped off in your mortgage, there's very few news organizations that are going to teach you how to do that. I think that that is the biggest threat to journalism in general, is that instead of working to make the people who are slightly informed even more informed, we're not working at all with folks who aren't getting these messages, don't even understand who their alderman is. You know, why are we leaving them out of this conversation? They need us the most.
Can I just add to that? I agree with that. And I think, just to add to that, I think from a traditional newsroom standpoint, going forward, because there are more investigative resources than there has been in a long time in the city, I think, in some of the outlets that we're seeing, Louise's being one of them for sure. But newsrooms, traditional newsrooms still feel that they have to cover the commodity news as a public service. And I would argue that traditional newsrooms have to get serious about redeploying their resources to cover those communities that are not being covered, because not doing so, you continue to lose your relationship with your audience. It's just a natural, it is so easy for an audience to find that content somewhere else, or for a startup to fill that gap, that then you become less relevant every day. But it is difficult for newspapers to let go, and but newsroom managers have to get very serious very quickly about redeploying resources to cover the city in a more significant way than they are now.
I would agree. I think many times we're still making decisions based on a long lost past. When you see 100 people standing outside Rod Blagojevich's house, and you think all of those are reporters who could be somewhere else at this very moment doing something that is unique and valuable, instead of listening to the same press conference as everyone else, I think we need to get much smarter about how we think about deployment of our resources.
I covered the Laquan McDonald trial for 5 weeks, I think it was, 5 or 6 weeks. And it was a new experience for me as a reporter who's always been off on his own stories, to be part of the press corps, you know, a group of people who were there every day, some sitting next to me live tweeting the trial, you know, something I could no more do than fly. This is kind of amazing to me. And I saw, you know, there was an esprit in the press corps, a kind of, we're all in the foxhole together. I saw how hard people worked in that context. But then I had this, you know, perception come over me. Here we are, the International Press Corps, for more than a month at 26th in California, all producing redundant stories about this one unfolding trial. There were so many stories in that building, so many injustices that were not reported on, not witnessed, not inquired into. And I think we continue to have that sort of skew in the way the profession operates. It's just sort of in the groundwater, in our DNA. And I think, you know, really thinking hard about that, and, you know, the sort of model of competing for attention with so much redundant coverage. And maybe as there's more and more of a ethos and a spirit of collaboration there can also be a more rational distribution of resources.
I wonder how much of that is driven by fear, though, right?
Fear and clickbait too, and revenue.
So, I mean, I think the Blagojevich circus was a great example. Everybody was there because they were terrified that something was going to happen and their competitors were going to have it and they wouldn't. And was there ever a question asked, does it matter, right?
Yeah.
And how do we stop editing or managing from a place of fear as opposed to a place of
Metrics.
what's possible? Sorry, I joined the panel for a second
we have just very few minutes left, and we've had people in line over here. Let's try to get a couple of very quick question in, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Hermina.
Hi, I don't really have a question. I just have money.
Hi.
I'll take it, Sue.
Hi.
Chicago Headline
got our address.
Foundation grants to 2 not-for-profit newsrooms $5,000 annually for hiring interns. So it's $5,000 you can get to pay for an intern for however long you negotiate with the intern. And information's on headlineclub.org. I'm sorry I don't have any leaflets to hand out. Also, we do a $5,000 scholarship for college communication students. So if you are an educator here, pass that on to your students. Thank you.
Is that only for nonprofits or is for for-profit,
It's
mission-based
for
organizations as well?
not-for-profits. All for
The
not-for-profits.
tribe is not a non-for-profit,
Oh,
so yes,
oh.
I just had to ask that. Because we get cut out of a lot of things because we
Yeah,
can't
well, in
afford
the
to
past,
be a non-for-profit. So
Block Club and WBEZ have both received intern grants and some other places. But I'm sorry, only for not-for-profits. Okay.
Okay. Dale Lehman, contributor to WZRD and Pacifica Radio. We've heard about journalism.
My alma mater, WZRD.
Well, yeah, your alma mater. We've heard about journalism, its relationship to democracy. Journalism used to, and maybe still does, mean challenging power. A lot of people in this society feel powerless, and they turn away from organizations that give them filler without challenging power. I know of at least one person on that panel that has challenged power, and it has shaken up City Hall or helped the activists in this town shake up City Hall. So what I'm surprised at is why I haven't heard people defending Julian Assange, who is the target for ruthless prosecution that will actually make, if it's successful and he's brought to this country for trial illegally, will make journalism in this town, investigative journalism, if there's anybody doing any of it that's worth reading or listening to, illegal and prosecutable. Perhaps people could speak out on his behalf. On Monday, he's going to trial in Britain on an extradition charge, a phony extradition charge, which is political. And yet in this town, unless you're into alternative media, which you do not hear anything about. Our public radio station has moved into the business arena for its support, and it stopped covering these kind of crucial stories. I mean, how would we know about the war crimes that the U.S. government has committed, or all the corrupt business and corporate dealings had it not been for WikiLeaks? So maybe you could speak to that, or maybe you could take it home and think about it. Thank you.
We are really rapidly running out of time. A brief question?
Yes. Oh, gosh. Yes, my name is Mark Brayboy. I am a music journalist that writes for a lot of different publications, but today I'm with the Sun-Times and the Tribe. And my line of journalism is undergoing a traumatic crisis with the loss of Greg Cottage. There's only one full-time music reporter in the entire city of Chicago. And I was just wondering, is there any, and considering how that this is such an important line of journalism that is a direct You know, it's a direct part of the community. It's a direct reflection of what happened in the community right now. And I was just wondering if there's any conversation on how to address this or remedy this with any of your publications.
So I think you're referring, is the one full-time music reporter our full-time? Lior. Yes. So I will say that the music section of the Chicago Reader has the most staffers of anyone, and we are constantly talking about it. And one of the things that I would say to my colleagues is that it is the year of Chicago music. The city has a lot of money to spend to promote this year of Chicago music, so now is the time to expand your music coverage.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamira Alexander. I'm the president and executive director of Public Narrative, formerly Community Media Workshop. And I'm really excited about all that I'm hearing this evening. But I want to just encourage you. We're going to send out a survey just asking what journalists could use what type of capacity support, capacity building support, simply because as I'm listening to you all, there's lots of work that we're doing on a ground level in communities throughout Chicago. And we've invited several of the folks into the room, into some of these projects. But as we go forward, and just for one example, considering bringing back news tips that Community Media Workshop done a long time ago, I don't want to bring it back from I'm studying the organization, learning about it, and seeing how we can rehash what we once did. I actually want to know how public narrative can be of support to you in your work presently. So simply, once you receive the email, if you would simply complete it, get it back to us, and we'll follow up with more details. Thank you.
Thank you all. I think Heather?
I was just going to say that I think we owe a round of applause to Ken Davis and Linda Paul for bringing us all together.
Especially Linda Paul.
Linda Paul, please stand up. Linda Paul, stand up. Stand up.
Linda won't stand up. She's the one sitting in the back corner there. Let's try to do the photo. Does anybody want to do it? Put your hand up if you want to be in the photo.
Let's
Nobody?
do it.
Okay,
Come on,
forget
don't be shy.
We won't do it. That's all right. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for
We'll
coming.
see you in 11 years.